It was early October when I decided to get away for a few days. I had just finished a long and stressful work project, and I felt drained, mentally and physically. I didn't want to go anywhere fancy or crowded. I needed quiet. I needed something real. So I booked a small, off-the-grid cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. The listing described it as rustic, secluded, and perfect for someone looking to escape modern life. That sounded like exactly what I needed. The drive up took longer than I expected. The roads got narrower and rougher the deeper I went into the forest. My phone signal vanished about an hour before I got there. There were no houses nearby, no stores, just miles and miles of trees. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was already setting behind the dense pine trees. The place looked rough but sturdy. Wooden walls that had turned gray with time, a tin roof, a small porch with a single rocking chair. There was a shed beside it and a rusted water pump out back. Inside, the cabin was simple. One room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove in the corner, a bed with a heavy wool blanket, a table and a single chair. There was no electricity, no running water, no cell service. I lit a few of the candles the owner had left and got a small fire going in the stove. The warmth and flickering light made the place feel a little more comfortable. I unpacked my things, ate a quick dinner of canned soup, and settled in for the night. The silence was thick. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of wind through the trees or the sound of something moving in the underbrush. I fell asleep quickly that first night. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to hike around the area. There wasn't a marked trail, but the trees weren't too dense to walk through. I wandered for hours, taking pictures, soaking in the smell of pine and earth. I didn't see a single person, no other cabins, no campsites, just endless forest. I kept track of my direction using a small compass and a topographic map I'd brought along. I made sure not to go too far, though. I didn't want to get lost. When I got back to the cabin around noon, I noticed something strange. The door was open, just slightly. I was sure I'd shut it before I left. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, scanning the trees, listening. Everything was quiet. I stepped forward slowly and pushed the door open with my boot. Inside, nothing looked out of place. My bag was still on the bed, the empty soup can still on the table. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked the entire cabin, even the small attic crawl space. There was no one, nothing. I decided maybe I had just forgotten to latch the door properly. Maybe the wind had blown it open. It was possible. Still, I started locking it with the wooden bar from the inside whenever I was in. I also kept my small camping hatchet close at hand, just in case. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing noises outside, light footsteps in the leaves, twigs snapping. At one point, I thought I heard what sounded like breathing just outside the wall. I sat up in bed, gripping the hatchet, straining to hear more. But everything went quiet again. I waited for what felt like an hour before I finally lay back down. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I found tracks, footprints, human. They were faint but definitely there, just outside the window near the bed. They circled the cabin and disappeared into the woods. I followed them for a bit, but they faded quickly into the underbrush. I couldn't tell where they came from or where they went. That day, I didn't leave the cabin. I stayed inside, kept the fire going, kept the door locked. I felt exposed and vulnerable. That night, I moved the table and wedged it against the door along with the bar. I turned off the candles and sat in the dark with the hatchet in my lap, just listening. Around midnight, I heard it again, soft footsteps around the cabin. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps circled the building, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped. I waited. Nothing. I stayed frozen in place for hours. Eventually, I fell asleep sitting up. When I woke up, the front door was still shut, the table still in place. But the window on the far side of the room was cracked open, just barely, a few inches. I was sure I hadn't opened it. I walked over slowly and looked around. No sign of anyone. I checked my bag. Nothing missing. But I noticed something small on the floor by the window. A single strip of cloth, maybe from a shirt or a jacket. Dark, dirty, and old. I packed my things immediately. I didn't care that I still had 2 days left. I was done. I loaded everything into my backpack, doused the fire, and stepped out into the cold morning. As I walked to my car, I kept scanning the woods, expecting to see someone watching. But there was no one. I got in, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as the bumpy road would let me. A few miles out, I passed something that chilled me even more. A tree beside the road, not far from the cabin's turn-off. At first, I didn't think anything of it. But then I saw what was on it: marks. Knife marks. Deep, angry slashes carved into the bark. They weren't random. They formed shapes. I didn't look too closely, but one looked like a spiral, another like a square with lines through it. Symbols, maybe. I didn't stop. I just kept driving. I didn't report anything. I didn't even contact the cabin owner. I didn't want to talk about it. I still don't know who was out there. A drifter? Someone living off the grid? Someone who thought the cabin was theirs? I don't know. But I do know this: I'll never go back to that place. And I'll never stay in a remote cabin again, no matter how peaceful it sounds. Because sometimes, when it's too quiet, you hear things you're not supposed to. And sometimes you're not as alone as you think you are. It started as a simple idea. I just wanted a few days to myself, no work, no people, no noise. I had been working nonstop for the past year, dealing with deadlines, calls, and back-to-back meetings. I felt burned out and irritated by everything. So I decided to get away from the city for a while. I found a small cabin listed online. It was about 3 hours north, deep in a wooded area in northern Minnesota, surrounded by tall pine trees and a lake just a short walk away. The photos made it look peaceful, exactly what I needed. I packed light, just clothes, food, a couple of books, and a flashlight. I didn't even bring my laptop. I left early on a Thursday morning. The drive was long and quiet. As I got farther away from the city, the traffic faded, and the roads turned narrow and winding. I saw fewer and fewer houses, and the gas stations started looking old and empty. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, I had no cell service. That was fine. I wanted to disconnect anyway. The cabin was small but well built. Just one main room with a bed, a small kitchen, and a table. There was a separate bathroom and a screened porch facing the woods. The place smelled like wood and old pine needles. There was no TV, no internet, and no reception, but there was a battery-powered radio and a small shed out back that had tools and firewood. The lake was only 5 minutes away by foot. I spent my first few hours just walking around, checking things out. The first night was quiet. I lit a fire in the little wood stove, made myself dinner, and read by lantern light. I went to bed early and slept well. No cars, no sirens, no emails buzzing on my phone. Just the sound of wind moving through trees and the occasional call of a loon from the lake. The second day I spent hiking around the area. There were narrow trails that looped through the forest, and I followed one that went all the way around the lake. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I didn't see a single person, not even footprints in the dirt trail, just animal tracks and fallen branches. At one point, I thought I heard movement in the woods, like someone walking, but when I stopped to listen, it was gone. I figured it was a deer. Still, I felt a little uneasy. That evening, I noticed something strange. One of the empty soda cans I left on the porch was gone. I thought maybe the wind blew it into the woods, but I checked around and didn't see it. It was weird, but I didn't think too much of it. I cooked, ate, and settled in for another quiet night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing sounds outside, not just animals. There was a scraping noise, like something brushing against the porch screens. At one point, I sat up in bed and listened hard. It sounded like someone stepping on the porch, slow and careful. My heart started pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window. I shined the light out but didn't see anything. Still, I locked the door and pushed a chair against it. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or something. The next morning, I found footprints on the porch. Not boots, bare feet, adult-sized. The screens had scratch marks too, like someone had dragged their fingernails along them. I just stood there for a while, staring at them. My stomach turned. I felt cold all over. Someone had been out there, watching me, walking around barefoot in the woods. That wasn't normal. I should have packed up right then, but I didn't. I told myself maybe someone lived nearby and was just messing around. Maybe a local kid. I didn't want to overreact. I stayed close to the cabin that day. I kept the door locked and the curtains closed. Every little sound outside made me jump. I didn't go down to the lake. I didn't explore. I just stayed inside. That night, I didn't light a fire. I kept the lantern off and stayed in bed with my flashlight. I listened for hours. At one point, I heard someone breathing just outside the window. I was too scared to look. I didn't move. I just lay there, barely breathing, gripping the flashlight. In the morning, I went outside again. The footprints were back. This time, they were all around the cabin. There were handprints on the windows, smudges like someone had leaned in and pressed their face to the glass. I had never felt fear like that before, not in a deep, real way. It didn't feel like a joke anymore. Someone was out there, and they knew I was alone. I went to the shed and found a rusty hatchet. I kept it with me all day. I thought about driving back, but my car was parked down a slope about 100 yards from the cabin. There were trees all around it. If someone was watching, they'd see me leave. Something about that thought made me freeze. I wasn't sure what to do. If I waited too long, something worse might happen. I started planning to leave the next morning. Pack up before sunrise, walk to the car fast, and just get out. That night was the worst. I barely slept. Every little creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I heard a knock. Just one. Then silence. My heart nearly stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even look toward the door. Then I heard it again. A knock, this time at the back window. Then another, and another, different sides of the cabin. It was like they were circling, testing every wall. Couldn't take it. I sat in the corner with the hatchet in my hand, knees pulled to my chest, eyes wide open. It went on like that for hours, scraping, knocking, sometimes whispering, though I couldn't make out words, just the sound of breath. Once or twice, I thought I saw a shadow pass by the porch. I didn't check. I didn't move. When morning came, I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't even bother cleaning up or locking the cabin. I sprinted to the car, looking over my shoulder the whole time. The forest was still, too still. I didn't see anyone. I got in the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. The tires kicked up dirt as I pulled away. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I checked my phone. No service. I drove another 30 minutes until I saw the first gas station. I pulled in, sat there for a long time just breathing. I looked in the mirrors, half expecting someone to be in the back seat. There wasn't. I never told anyone about it. Not really. I didn't want to sound crazy. I didn't call the police. What would I say? That someone barefoot was walking around my cabin? That they scratched at my windows and knocked all night? I hadn't seen a face. I hadn't been attacked. There was no proof. But I know what happened. I know someone was out there. I'll never go back. I'll never rent a remote cabin again. I still wake up some nights thinking I hear that knock. Just one knock, then silence. And I always check the windows now, every night, just in case. I think a part of me always knew something was going to go wrong. Maybe not in a big, dramatic way, but wrong enough to leave a permanent mark. It started when I decided to take a break from work for a week. I was feeling burned out, my eyes constantly tired, my thoughts scattered all over the place. I hadn't really slept well in months. My chest always felt heavy, like I was carrying something that I couldn't see. I told myself I needed silence, just a full week away from people, from traffic, from screens, from everything that made noise and demanded attention. So I booked a small cabin out in the mountains of northern Idaho. It wasn't too deep in the woods, but far enough to feel completely alone. The kind of place where there's no cell service, no neighbors for miles, and no streetlights once the sun goes down. I found the listing on a vacation rental site. The pictures looked decent, nothing fancy, Just a one-room wooden cabin with a fireplace, a small bed, a table, and a bathroom with an old shower. A little deck in the front looked out into the trees. It was late October. The weather was chilly but not too cold yet. Just cool enough that I could sit outside in a sweater and listen to the wind moving through the pine trees. That was the plan. Go there, sit, breathe, write in a notebook if I felt like it, go for walks during the day, maybe cook some simple food on the propane stove. No news, no emails, no deadlines. I left early in the morning and drove about 5 hours from where I lived. The last hour of the drive was on a narrow dirt road that wound up into the mountains. My car didn't like it. Every bump and rut made it groan, and I started worrying that maybe I should have rented a truck instead. But I made it. When I pulled into the small dirt clearing where the cabin stood, I turned off the engine and just sat there for a few minutes. The silence was heavier than I expected. It wasn't the gentle kind of quiet I thought it would be. It was like the air itself was thick. Still, I looked around and realized how far I really was from everything. The cabin was just like in the pictures, maybe a bit older. The wood on the outside was more weathered. A couple of shingles were missing from the roof. The windows were dusty, but the key worked, and the door creaked open. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and something slightly sour like old cloth. But it wasn't awful. I set my bags down and checked everything. There was running water, though the pipes made a strange groaning noise when I first turned on the faucet. The toilet flushed. The little stove clicked on after a few tries. The bed didn't look clean, but I'd brought my own sleeping bag and pillow. I unpacked everything and opened the windows for some fresh air. The sun was still up. It cast long shadows across the floor as it came through the trees. That first evening was calm. I made pasta from a box and sat outside on the little wooden chair, eating slowly while watching the sky turn orange and then dark blue. The wind was light. I could hear birds far off. I saw a few deer come out through the trees, walking slowly, their hooves quiet in the dead leaves. I felt peaceful. I thought maybe this was what I'd been needing all along, just to sit and not be anything for a while. I went inside when it got too dark to see. I lit a few candles that were already in the cabinet. I read a paperback book until my eyes felt heavy, then rolled out my sleeping bag on top of the mattress and lay down. It was completely silent. I don't think I'd ever heard quiet that deep before. No cars, no distant sirens, no hum from a refrigerator, just still air. But I couldn't sleep well. The wind started picking up around midnight. I could hear it pushing against the windows. The trees creaked. Once or twice, I heard something sharp fall on the roof, probably pine cones or small branches. But still, every sound out here felt louder than it should. My heart would jump, and I'd have to remind myself there were no people out here, nothing to worry about. In the morning, I felt groggy. I hadn't slept more than a few hours. I made instant coffee and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp. I walked around the area a bit, looked at the trees, followed a small trail downhill. It wasn't marked, but it looked like animals had used it. I didn't go too far, just far enough to feel like I'd moved. I ate granola for lunch, sat and read some more. I tried writing in my notebook, but ended up just doodling. I told myself it was fine. I didn't need to do anything. That second night, I went to bed early. I was tired. My back ached a little from the hard mattress, but I figured I'd get used to it. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. I had no idea what had pulled me out of sleep, but my eyes were open and my ears were straining in the dark. I could hear the wind again, a light crackling, like dry leaves being pushed around. Then I heard a thump on the deck, a heavy one, not sharp, not like a branch. It sounded deliberate. I held my breath. Then it was quiet again. I laid there, barely moving, trying not to make a sound. I thought maybe it was a raccoon or a deer, but deer didn't usually climb steps, and raccoons were light. This had weight, like boots. I reached slowly for my phone, just out of habit. But of course, there was no signal. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed in the sleeping bag, my ears open. But I didn't hear anything else after that. The next morning, I told myself I was being stupid, probably a fallen branch. The deck could have shifted, or it was an animal heavier than I thought. I opened the door and looked. Nothing seemed out of place, but there were two marks on the deck, faint but wide, almost like someone had dragged something across the boards. Not fresh, could have been old, couldn't tell. I stared at it for too long. Then I told myself to stop. I made coffee again. I tried to relax. That third day, I stayed close to the cabin. I walked in small loops around it. I collected some small wood, thinking maybe I'd light the fireplace later. The cold was starting to bite harder now. When I sat outside, I kept glancing back toward the trees. I thought I saw movement more than once, but every time I looked straight, it was nothing. I went inside earlier than usual. I bolted the door. I shoved one of the chairs in front of it too, just in case. I don't know why. I sat in the corner and stared at the door for a while. I knew I was getting too anxious. I tried to calm myself down. I read more. I even cooked something again, but I kept checking the windows. I thought I saw shadows, but shadows move when the wind moves the trees. I told myself that over and over. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 3:30 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just a thump. It was footsteps, slow ones, across the deck. And then, something touched the door. Not knocking, just pressure, like a slow push. The wood creaked a little, then nothing. My throat was dry. My mouth was open, but I didn't make a sound. I didn't move. I laid there, every muscle tense. I could feel my heartbeat in my neck. I waited for the door to move again. Didn't. After what felt like forever, I crawled to the small window beside the bed and looked through the corner. I saw nothing, just the deck, the trees, the dark. I stayed awake until sunrise. When the light came in, I opened the door fast and checked everything. Nothing was there, but the chair I'd put against the door had shifted slightly. The bolt was still in place. The steps had a few muddy prints on them. Not clear ones, not shoe prints, just marks, like someone or something had come up the steps with wet feet. I wanted to leave, but I had 3 more days booked. I didn't want to waste money. I told myself again that I was overthinking it. No one was out here. No one knew I was here. There was no reason for anyone to be near this cabin. But something had been. The 4th day, I took a long walk. I needed to get out of the space. I followed the animal trail deeper into the trees, curved around a slope, went down past a few rocks, and eventually opened into a clearing. I stood there, breathing hard. Then I noticed something on the far side of the clearing. It was another cabin, but this one looked abandoned, older, smaller. The roof had partially collapsed. The windows were missing. I approached slowly. There were no signs of recent life, but when I stepped up onto the porch, I noticed footprints in the dirt. Just a few, fresh ones. They weren't mine. I stepped inside. The inside was mostly empty. Just an old chair, a table, and a pile of dirty blankets in the corner. A few cans scattered around. Some empty water bottles. Someone had been here recently, very recently. I felt my stomach twist. That's when I noticed the wall. Someone had scratched something into the wood over and over again. Just a single word, stay. Covered half the wall. Deep cuts. Some looked old, some fresh. I left. I didn't run, but I moved fast. The trail back felt longer than it had before. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every sound made my nerves jump. When I got back to my cabin, I locked the door and shut all the windows. It was early September when I decided to take some time off work. I had some leftover vacation days that were going to expire if I didn't use them soon. I worked a pretty basic job at a small logistics company. It was boring and repetitive, but it paid the bills. I lived alone in a small apartment on the edge of town and didn't really do much outside of work. I thought maybe some time away, somewhere quiet, would help me reset a little. I didn't have any big plans, no overseas trips or anything fancy. I just wanted silence, no emails, no city noise, no other people. So I looked online and found a rental cabin deep in the woods, about a 4-hour drive north of where I lived. It was in a remote area, very remote actually. The listing had pictures of this small wooden cabin surrounded by dense trees. It looked like something out of an old book. No nearby neighbors. The description said it was off-grid but comfortable, with solar panels for electricity, a wood-burning stove for heat, and a small creek out back for water. There was also a well and a backup water tank, just in case. I wasn't the type of person who went out in nature much, but I figured a week alone in a place like that could be what I needed. I packed a week's worth of food, mostly canned stuff, dry goods, and some bottled water. I brought a few books, a flashlight, extra batteries, a small axe, and a folding knife. I had no plans to hike or explore too far. I just wanted to be alone in the quiet. I didn't even bring a laptop. I brought my phone, but the listing said there would be no service. That was fine with me. I was actually looking forward to not being reachable. The drive up was pretty simple. I left on a Monday morning around 9 a.m. and stopped once for gas and a sandwich. As I got closer to the area, the road became less maintained. Eventually, I turned off the main road and followed a long gravel path through the forest. It was bumpy and narrow, and I had to go slow. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No other cars, no houses, no signs, nothing. I passed a rusted old gate that was left open. After that, it was just trees and dirt for what felt like miles. Finally, I reached a small clearing, and there it was, the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, but looked exactly like the photos. The wood siding was weathered but solid. The roof had thick green moss growing along the edges. There was a tiny porch with 2 chairs and an old wooden table. A narrow chimney stuck out of the roof. Around the back, I saw the creek, which made a soft rushing sound as it moved over rocks. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. I unpacked everything from the car and brought it inside. The inside was one large room with a wood floor and log walls. On the left was a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a sink, some shelves, and a tiny fridge connected to the solar setup. On the right was a simple bed with thick blankets and a few pillows. In the center of the room was the wood stove, a table, and 1 chair. The bathroom was separate, a small shack about 10 feet from the main cabin. No shower, just a compost toilet and a water basin. It wasn't luxury, but it wasn't horrible either. That first day, I just settled in. I walked around the property a bit, stacked some firewood near the porch, tested the stove, and made sure everything worked. I ate dinner early, just canned beans and bread, and then sat outside as the sun went down. The air got cold fast once the light faded. I remember hearing nothing at all. No birds, no wind, just the soft noise of the creek. Felt like I had dropped off the edge of the world. I went inside, got a fire going, and read until I got sleepy. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep you only get when there's no traffic noise, no lights, no distractions. The next few days were mostly the same. I woke up around sunrise, made oatmeal, and then just sat outside for a while. I spent hours reading or walking near the creek. The woods were beautiful. Every tree looked like it had been there for hundreds of years. The only signs of animals I saw were a few deer tracks near the water and some squirrels. There was a calm to the place. I didn't even think about my job or anything back home. But on the 4th day, something changed. It started with a noise. It was late afternoon, and I was sitting on the porch with a book. I heard what sounded like someone walking through the woods. Not far, maybe 100 feet away. At first, I thought it might be a deer or something, but the steps were heavy. It sounded like boots on dirt. Came in bursts, 2 or 3 steps, then silence. I stood up and looked out toward the trees. Nothing. The woods were still and dark between the trunks. I waited, but I didn't hear it again. Eventually, I sat back down and convinced myself it had just been a branch falling or maybe my imagination. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound seemed louder. The wind moving through the trees outside made a low, steady rustling. The fire in the stove crackled, and the walls creaked once or twice. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up feeling like something wasn't right. The room felt colder than it should have been. I looked at the fire, and it had burned low but wasn't out. I thought maybe the door had blown open, so I got up and checked. The door was shut and latched. I walked over to the one small window and looked out into the dark. I couldn't see anything except the faint outline of the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring. Nothing moved. I went back to bed, but it took a while to fall asleep. The next morning, I walked a bit further into the woods to see if I could find any sign of what I had heard. I didn't see footprints or anything unusual, just the same soft forest floor covered in pine needles. But the feeling in my gut stayed. It was like I wasn't alone anymore, like someone else was nearby, just out of sight. That afternoon, I went to get water from the creek. The water was cold and clear, and I usually filled a bucket and used a filter inside. As I bent down, I noticed something upstream, maybe 30 feet away. It was a pile of rocks stacked in a neat little tower, maybe 4 or 5 rocks high. It wasn't natural. The rocks were too cleanly balanced. I hadn't seen it before. I walked closer and saw another stack just a few feet from it. Then another. I counted 6 of them, spaced out along the edge of the water. I didn't touch them. I just backed away and returned to the cabin. The feeling of being watched got worse. I kept looking over my shoulder, even inside the cabin. That evening, I was chopping some kindling when I heard the footsteps again. This time it was faster, like someone running for a second or two and then stopping. I dropped the axe and looked around, but again I saw nothing. I stood there for a long time, my heart beating fast. Then I picked up the axe, went inside, and locked the door. I kept the fire going and didn't read that night. I just sat at the table, staring at the door. I couldn't explain why I was so on edge, but I felt it in every part of my body. Something wasn't right. That night, just after I lay down, I heard a sound that made my blood go cold. It was the sound of footsteps on the porch. Not animals, not wind. Slow, heavy steps, creaking wood. They came up to the door and stopped. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The fire gave off a dull orange glow, just enough to see the door. I waited, frozen. No knock, no voice, just silence. After a few minutes, the footsteps moved again, slowly stepping off the porch. Then nothing. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I stepped outside and looked at the ground. The dirt near the steps was scuffed, but it was hard to tell if it was from boots or something else. I walked around the cabin in a wide circle. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. I went to the creek again. The stone piles were gone, every single one. That was the moment I decided I was going to leave early. I had 2 more nights left, but I didn't care. I packed my things into the car and double-checked everything. The car started fine. I backed up, turned onto the dirt path, and started driving out. About 10 minutes down the trail, I saw something in the road up ahead. It was a tree branch, thick, heavy, like it had been snapped off and dragged. It was placed directly across the path, too big to drive over. I stopped the car and got out. I looked around. The forest was silent. I moved the branch, struggling to drag it to the side. As I pushed it away, I saw something carved into the trunk of a tree nearby. It looked fresh. It was a shape, a triangle with a line through it. I didn't recognize it. It didn't look like anything natural. I didn't take time to think about it. I got back in the car and drove faster. When I finally got back to the paved road, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station an hour later. There, I sat in the car for a long time, just holding the steering wheel. I wasn't sure what had happened back there. I didn't see anyone. I didn't find evidence. But I knew in my gut that someone had been near that cabin, watching. Maybe the place was used by someone else who didn't want me there. Maybe it was some kind of hunter or squatter. I didn't know, but I knew I had left just in time. I never told anyone the full story. When people asked about my trip, I just said it was the middle of September when I decided to take a break from everything. Work had drained the life out of me for months, and my mind felt heavy all the time. I needed space. I needed silence. I found a small, cheap cabin listed on a rental site that looked just remote enough to be perfect. It was tucked deep into the Oregon woods, surrounded by thick pine forests and gravel roads that stretched for miles. The pictures looked basic: no TV, no Wi-Fi, no cell reception. That was exactly what I was looking for. The cabin sat by itself near the edge of a ridge, not too high up, but still surrounded by thick woods on all sides. I drove 6 hours to get there, mostly on empty highways and then rough, winding roads that kicked up dust and small rocks. I had to slow down several times because the road was narrow and filled with potholes. My small SUV managed fine, but I could feel every bump. When I finally reached the cabin, I sat in the car for a minute, staring at the wooden structure. It was small but sturdy, built from dark wood that looked aged but strong. The roof was slanted, covered with moss in places, and the windows were square with old wooden frames. A small porch stretched across the front with 2 steps leading up to it. Trees stood like walls all around it, thick trunks and branches blocking out most of the sky. Inside, the place was simple. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen with an old fridge and stove, and a fireplace. There was a couch and a small table with 2 chairs. Everything smelled a little like old pine and dust. It wasn't dirty, just old. There were scratches on the wooden floor, water stains on the ceiling, and a few spider webs in corners. I opened the windows to let in some fresh air and unpacked what I had brought. Mostly canned food, a few books, clothes, a flashlight, and some basic tools. I didn't plan to do anything here but rest and think. The first night was quiet. I sat outside on the porch after dinner, watching the trees move slightly in the wind. It got dark fast, and the stars came out clear and bright. Felt peaceful. When I went inside, I built a fire in the fireplace and lay on the couch. No phone buzzing, no emails, no people. Just the crackling of the fire and the sound of the wind outside. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke up early. The cabin was cold, so I made some coffee and sat on the steps of the porch wrapped in a blanket. I could hear birds and the occasional rustle of animals in the trees. It felt good to be disconnected from everything. I took a short walk along one of the trails behind the cabin. It wasn't marked, but the path was clear enough. The forest felt alive but not threatening. I followed the trail for about an hour, turned around, and came back. The rest of the day, I read and cooked a small meal. It was the 3rd night that things started to feel strange. I had fallen asleep on the couch again and woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. I don't know what woke me, but I felt uneasy. The fire had died out, and the cabin was dark and cold. I sat up and listened. There was nothing at first. Then I heard it, a soft thud, like something hitting the porch outside. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to catch my attention. I stayed still for a long time, just listening. A few minutes passed. Then another sound, this time softer, like a shuffle. My heart started to beat faster. I stood up quietly and moved to the window. I couldn't see anything outside. It was too dark. I had a flashlight, but I didn't want to turn it on yet. I just stared through the glass, trying to make out any shapes. Eventually, I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or something. I forced myself to go back to sleep, but it took a long time. The next morning, I checked the porch. Nothing looked out of place. There were a few leaves scattered around, but that was it. No tracks. I walked around the cabin, looked at the ground. I didn't see anything unusual. Still, something felt different. The air felt thicker, the forest quieter. I brushed it off, trying not to let my imagination take over. But the feeling didn't go away. I stayed inside most of the day. I kept thinking about the sound I heard, the way it didn't match the peaceful feeling I had before. That night, I locked the door, made sure all the windows were closed, and built a bigger fire. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night. Same time, around 2:10 a.m. The fire had burned down low, casting weak shadows across the walls. This time, I heard something that made my stomach turn. It was breathing, slow, steady breathing. Not mine, not close, but not far either. It sounded like it was coming from just outside the wall near the back of the cabin. I didn't move. I just listened. The breathing continued for maybe 2 minutes. Then it stopped. I waited another 10 minutes before I stood up and slowly walked to the back window. I didn't see anything, but the fear stayed with me. Felt different now. Not like an animal. Felt human. The next day, I decided to check the area behind the cabin more carefully. I found nothing. No tracks. No signs of someone being there. But then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. About 30 feet behind the cabin, there was a tree with fresh scratches on it. Long, deep ones down the bark. They didn't look like claw marks, more like someone had taken a knife or something sharp and dragged it down. The wood underneath was still a little damp. It hadn't been there long. I backed away from the tree and went inside. My hands were shaking. I started to think about packing up and leaving early, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe it was some hunter, maybe kids messing around. Still, I kept the axe next to the couch that night. I didn't sleep at all. That night, the breathing came back, closer. Then I heard something new. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, steady footsteps, like someone trying not to make noise. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight and axe. I turned the flashlight on quickly and pointed it toward the window. Nothing. I stood and walked slowly to the front door, heart pounding. I placed my ear against the wood. Silence. I unlocked the door and opened it quickly. Flashlight aimed. The porch was empty. I stepped outside and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. No sounds. I stood there for a few minutes, my breath visible in the cold air. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I went back inside, locked the door, and stayed up the rest of the night. The next morning, I found footprints. Just a few, leading from the side of the cabin to the edge of the woods. They were boot prints. Not fresh, but not old either. I followed them for about 30 yards before they disappeared into thicker brush. That's when I noticed something hanging on a branch. A piece of cloth, black, frayed at the end, like the sleeve of a jacket. That was enough. I packed everything, threw it into the back of my SUV, and left. The drive down the gravel road felt longer. I kept checking the rearview mirror. Every time I slowed down for a turn, I thought I saw movement in the trees. I didn't stop once. When I got home, I didn't unpack for days. I kept thinking about the sounds, the scratches, the cloth. I reported it to the rental site, told them someone had been lurking around. They said no one had rented the place before me for months. It had been empty since spring. They offered me a refund. I didn't take it. Weeks passed, and the fear faded, but not completely. I started checking my windows more. I installed cameras around my house. I kept the axe near my bed. I never went back to the woods. And even now, sometimes at night, I wake up around 2 a.m. and I listen. I had always liked being alone in the woods. Not in a spiritual way or anything like that, I just liked the quiet. No city noise. No constant phone notifications. No traffic. Just the sound of wind in the trees and the crunch of leaves under my boots. Felt clean. Honest. So when I booked a cabin way up north in Montana, far off the main roads and deep in the woods, I didn't think twice. It was early September. Cold up there already, especially at night, but I didn't mind. I had camped in worse. The listing described it as a hunter's cabin. No Wi-Fi, no plumbing, no neighbors, and 20 miles from the nearest paved road. That was what I wanted. The place had one bedroom, a small kitchen area with a wood-burning stove, and a generator-powered light. No cell service, of course. The host gave me directions over email. Handwritten directions. That should have been my first clue that this place was out there. But I didn't mind. I drove up from Bozeman in my old Tacoma, packed with a few weeks' worth of food, gear, firewood, water containers, my .308 rifle, and some tools. It was supposed to be a 2-week trip. Just me and the trees. Time to reset. The dirt road was rough. I followed it for almost an hour after turning off the last paved stretch. No signs, no markings, just trees and the occasional old fence post. The directions were clear enough though, and eventually I pulled up to a small clearing with the cabin at the far end. It looked just like the photos. A little box of dark wood, one window on each side, and a metal chimney poking out the roof. There was a log pile on the side, a rusty axe leaning against the porch. Everything was quiet. I unloaded the truck, started the generator to get the lights on, and settled in. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. They were old but solid. The first few days were peaceful. I'd wake up early, make coffee on the stove, walk through the woods with my rifle, then come back and cook something simple. Read, chop wood. Nope. Sometimes I'd hike down to the stream about a half-mile away to wash up. The water was ice cold, but clear. I didn't see another person the whole time. No trails, no parked trucks, no sounds of ATVs or voices. Just birds, the occasional deer, and once I thought I saw a bear far off through the trees, but it didn't come close. I liked the solitude. That started to change on the 5th night. I had gone to bed around 9 p.m. It had rained that day and everything was damp. I left the fire burning low in the stove to keep the place warm. I remember lying in bed, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening to the stove creak and pop. I drifted off like I always did. I woke up maybe 2 or 3 hours later. Something wasn't right. It wasn't a noise that woke me. It was the silence. No wind, no creaks, no fire crackle. Nothing. Just this strange stillness. Then I heard it. A soft crunch outside, like a boot on wet leaves. Then another. My heart jumped. I wasn't sure I had heard it right. I held my breath, straining to listen. Crunch. Closer now. Just one footstep. I sat up very slowly. I didn't move for a full minute. Then I quietly slid out of the sleeping bag and walked to the window on the left wall. Faced the woods. I looked out, but saw nothing. It was dark. No moon. No stars. Another crunch, now near the back of the cabin. I stepped back from the window. My rifle was leaning against the wall by the front door. I grabbed it, made sure the safety was on, and stood there in the dark, heart pounding. I waited. The footsteps stopped. I didn't hear them walk away, just stopped completely. I stayed awake for the next 2 hours, standing by the window with the rifle in my hands. Eventually, I sat on the edge of the bed, listening. Nothing happened. When it started to get light outside, I finally opened the door and stepped out slowly. The air was cold, damp. I looked around the clearing. No tracks, not even mine, thanks to the pine needles and wet ground. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a bear stepping around the cabin, sniffing. I told myself that, but I didn't believe it. I knew the sound of boots on leaves. I'd made that sound every day since I arrived. This was different. That morning, I walked a slow circle around the cabin, rifle in hand. Nothing. No markings. No prints. I didn't see anything strange. But from that day forward, I felt watched. It was just a feeling at first, like something was out there. I'd catch myself glancing into the trees while cooking or chopping wood. Nothing obvious. No movement. But that feeling stuck with me like wet clothes. The next night, I stacked firewood by the door. I kept the axe inside. I locked the door tight and blocked it with a chair. I even dragged a few heavy logs in front of the back window just in case. That night, I woke again. Same time, same sound. Crunch. Closer now. Then nothing. I didn't go outside. I just stayed there, holding the rifle, breathing through my nose so I could listen. My hands shook. I didn't sleep at all. By the 8th day, I was exhausted, bags under my eyes. I tried to pretend I was imagining it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks from being alone too long. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That afternoon, I decided to walk the perimeter. Not just a circle around the cabin, but a full loop out about 50 yards into the woods in every direction. Took me an hour. I marked trees with chalk as I went so I wouldn't double back. I saw nothing strange until I came back to the rear side of the cabin. That's when I saw the scratch marks on a tree, for gouges deep maybe 2 feet off the ground. Fresh. I ran my fingers over them. The wood was still moist. They weren't claw marks. They looked more like someone had dragged a metal object down the trunk. They hadn't been there the day before. I went back inside. I didn't leave again that day. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window with my rifle, a lantern lit low beside me. I thought about leaving in the morning, but part of me wanted to see who or what it was. I wanted proof. I wanted a reason. Then came the sound. This time it was different. It wasn't footsteps. It was tapping. On the back wall. Light. Slow. One tap every few seconds. I froze. The tapping kept going for a full minute. Then stopped. Then footsteps again. Circling. Then silence. I sat there, heart pounding so hard I thought I'd pass out. Then came a new sound. The doorknob. Slowly turning. Then shaking. Just a little. I got up and aimed the rifle at the door. It stopped. I didn't sleep. I just sat there all night. At dawn, I ran outside and looked. No prints, no markings on the door, nothing. I packed everything that morning. I was done. I loaded the truck and started back down the dirt road, going slow. My hands were tight on the wheel. Every turn, I kept checking the rear view. About 10 miles down the road, I spotted something. A small pile of rocks, stacked in the middle of the trail, carefully placed. 6 of them, smooth, flat, balanced perfectly. That pile wasn't there when I came up. I stopped the truck, just stared at it. I didn't want to get out. Eventually, I steered around it through the brush. I made it back to town that evening. I didn't stop until I was on pavement again. Signal back on my phone, the sound of cars in the distance. I never went back. I reported it to the sheriff's office. They told me it was probably a hunter messing with me, maybe a squatter. They said they'd send someone out. I never heard back. Months later, I checked the listing again. It was gone. Not just offline, deleted. The host account didn't exist anymore. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know they watched me. I know they waited until I was asleep. I know they touched the door. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't go where there's no signal. And I never ignore strange sounds at night. Ever again. I needed to get away from the city for a while. Everything had been weighing down on me. Work deadlines, noise, the constant pressure of being around people. My head felt like it was filled with static, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a full night's sleep. So when I found a quiet cabin listed online, deep in the woods of northern Michigan, I didn't think twice. It was advertised as peaceful, isolated, and surrounded by nothing but pine trees, lakes, and old hiking trails. It sounded perfect. The drive was long, about 9 hours from where I lived in Chicago. Most of it was highway driving, but the last 2 hours were winding back roads that felt more and more forgotten the deeper I went. My phone signal started dropping somewhere after the last gas station. The trees got thicker. Road signs disappeared. Eventually, it was just me, the dirt road, and the trees pressing in on both sides. The cabin itself sat at the end of a narrow path that split off from the main dirt road. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-story structure made of dark, weather-worn wood with a metal roof and a tiny deck out front. A chimney poked out from one side, and there was a narrow gravel driveway just wide enough for my car. I parked, stepped out, and just stood there for a moment. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was silent, not city silent, real silent. No cars, no people, no hum of electronics. Just wind and trees. The key had been left in a lockbox near the front door. I punched in the code the owner gave me and let myself in. Inside, the cabin was simple. 1 bedroom, a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a living room area with a couch and a big window looking out at the woods. No TV, just some books and a radio that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The bathroom was tiny but clean. There was a back door that led to a small patio facing the woods, and I noticed an axe leaning against a chopping stump nearby, next to a stack of firewood. I dropped my bag, made some instant coffee, and stood on the back patio. For the first time in months, I felt something close to calm. I stayed outside until the sun started dipping behind the trees and the air turned cold. That night, I lit a fire in the wood stove, opened one of the old books on the shelf, and dozed off on the couch. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. I wasn't sure what it was at first. My heart was racing, but I didn't know why. It wasn't a dream. Something had woken me up. I sat up and listened. There it was again, a kind of scraping noise. Not loud, but definitely there. I waited, barely breathing. Then I heard it again. Metal dragging against wood. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and shone it around the room. Everything looked normal. I walked to the back door and looked out the window. Nothing. The woods were pitch black. I thought maybe it was an animal. Raccoons, maybe. Or deer. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I walked around the cabin just to check things out. That's when I saw it. One of the windows on the far side of the cabin, The side I hadn't really looked at when I arrived had a crack running across it, and the screen was pulled out like someone had tried to get in. It didn't look fresh, but it didn't look old either. The glass wasn't shattered, but something about it bothered me. I told myself maybe it had been like that before I got there. The cabin was old, after all. I went back inside and tried to shake the feeling. I made breakfast, read a bit more, and then decided to explore the woods a little. There was a trail behind the cabin that led downhill toward a small lake. The walk was nice, quiet, peaceful, but I couldn't stop thinking about that window. I ended up cutting the walk short and heading back. Something just didn't feel right. That night, I made a fire again. I brought my bag into the bedroom with me this time, just in case. I fell asleep around 11. Then something woke me up again. This time, it was a thud. Not loud, but solid, like something heavy hitting the ground. I sat up fast, heart pounding. I reached for the flashlight and aimed it at the window. Nothing. I got up, walked to the living room, and shined the light outside. There were boot prints in the snow. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there, staring. There hadn't been snow when I went to bed. It must have started falling while I was asleep. The boot prints led from the trees up to the back patio, and then they just stopped. Like whoever made them had walked right up to the cabin and disappeared. There were no prints leading away. I backed away from the window. My legs felt weak. I went to the front door, checked the lock, then did the same for the back. Both were still locked. I pulled the curtains shut, turned off the light, and sat on the floor with my back against the wall. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, the prints were gone, covered by more snow. But I knew what I saw, and I knew I wasn't alone out there. I tried to call someone, anyone, but my phone still had no signal. I even drove up the road for a few miles, hoping to catch a bar or two, but nothing. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but something kept me there. I couldn't explain it. I felt like if I left without knowing what was going on, I'd never feel right again. That afternoon, I walked the property again. That's when I found the cigarette butt. It was tucked near the edge of the firewood stack, fresh, half-smoked. I don't smoke. The cabin owner had said in the listing that it was a non-smoking property. So who had been smoking near the firewood pile? I looked around, trying to see if there were any other signs, and I saw them, more boot prints. Faint, but definitely there, leading around the side of the cabin, near the broken window. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call for help. I didn't want to sleep there another night, but I didn't want to drive 9 hours back home without knowing who was creeping around the place. I decided to stay just one more night. I told myself I'd stay awake, keep the lights off, and see if whoever it was came back. That evening, I turned off every light. I kept the fire low so it wouldn't cast shadows. I sat in the darkest corner of the living room with the flashlight and a kitchen knife. My heart was beating so loud I could hear it in my ears. Hours passed. Nothing. Then, just past 2 a.m., I saw movement. A shadow moving outside the window. Slowly, carefully, like someone trying not to be seen. I held my breath and waited. The figure stepped closer to the window. I couldn't see a face, but I could tell it was a man, tall, broad-shouldered. He stood there, just looking in. Then he moved to the door and tried the handle. It didn't budge. He paused. Then he walked around the side of the cabin, out of view. I ran to the back window and watched. He was near the firewood again, crouching down. I realized what he was doing. He was trying to use the axe to pry open the back door. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and sprinted for the front door. I threw it open and ran to the car. The cold hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. I started the engine and peeled out of the driveway, gravel flying. I didn't look back. I drove until the sun came up. I didn't stop until I found a gas station with a phone signal. I called the police. I told them everything. They said they'd send someone to check it out. A few days later, I got a call. They'd found signs of forced entry. The back door had been damaged, and the window had been broken further. Inside, there were muddy footprints, cigarette butts, and trash left behind. No one was there when they arrived, but they said it looked like someone had been squatting there for a while. The owner had no idea. He hadn't been up to the cabin in over a year. He said he'd hired a cleaner and a maintenance guy to check on it once every few months, but he hadn't heard from them in a while. I don't know who the man was or how long he'd been watching the cabin. I don't know if he knew I was there the first night or if he was just waiting for the right moment. All I know is that if I hadn't woken up when I did, if I hadn't gotten out when I did, things could have ended very differently. I haven't been back to a cabin since, and I never will. It was early October when I decided to take some time away from everything and head up to a small, isolated cabin I had rented online. I'd been burned out from work, dealing with long hours, no weekends, and no real peace. The cabin was about 4 hours north of the city, near a small lake and tucked between stretches of thick forest. The listing said it had running water, power from a generator, and basic supplies. No internet, no cell service. That was the point. The drive up felt like a transition into another world. The highways turned into narrow roads, then to cracked pavement, and eventually a long dirt trail surrounded by tall trees. My car crunched slowly over fallen leaves as the late afternoon sun flickered through the branches. The air was already colder than the city, and the sky had that pale gray tone that always came before dusk in the fall. When I reached the cabin, it looked older than I expected, but solid. Weathered wood, a small porch with a couple of chairs, and a single chimney poking out of the roof. The place sat maybe 50 feet from the lake. It was calm and quiet. No sounds except for the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the boards under my boots as I stepped up to the door. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a fireplace, a couch, a small table, and a kitchen corner with a fridge, sink, and cupboards. There was one bedroom and a bathroom with an old but working shower. The power worked when I flipped the switch. The lights were dim, and the fridge hummed softly. Everything was stocked as promised. Canned food, water bottles, firewood. The first evening was peaceful. I made a fire, opened a can of chili, and sat outside on the porch. The sun dipped below the trees, and the air got colder. I watched the lake turn dark and still. I was glad I came. I hadn't felt that quiet in months. The second day, I woke up early and walked around the lake. There was a narrow trail that looped around, barely visible through the fallen leaves. I didn't see anyone else, no hikers, no signs of cabins nearby. It really was isolated. The only sound was the crunching under my boots and the rustling of trees. I stayed out longer than planned, and by the time I got back, I was hungry and tired. That night, something felt different. Not wrong, just off. I kept hearing a soft thumping sound outside. I thought maybe it was branches falling or a deer walking nearby. The woods were alive like that, but it didn't stop. It would happen, pause, then come again. Soft, like something tapping or hitting the porch lightly. I checked outside with a flashlight. Nothing. No animals. No wind strong enough to move anything. I tried to ignore it and went back to bed. The third day was cloudy. It never really got bright out. I stayed in most of the day, writing in a notebook and reading. Around late afternoon, I heard the thumping again. Same sound. A soft, uneven knock, like something brushing against the wall or porch. I stood still inside and waited. The sound stopped again. When I opened the door, I saw nothing, but I did notice something strange. There were marks on the dirt just past the porch. Not footprints exactly, but something had been dragged. They were long, shallow grooves, like something heavy had been pulled slowly across the dirt. They didn't lead in a straight line. They curved around the side of the cabin and disappeared into the trees. I stood there a long time, looking at them. I thought maybe a branch had fallen and rolled. Maybe a bear had passed through. But the marks were strange, clean, as if whatever made them didn't weigh much, but still moved with force. That night, I didn't sleep much. I stayed near the window, watching the edge of the trees. I thought I saw movement once or twice, but it could have been my eyes adjusting in the dark. The wind picked up and the trees swayed hard. I finally dozed off near dawn. The fourth day, I was uneasy. I kept checking the marks outside. Some looked fresh again. New trails. Same curve, same length. No prints, no fur, no broken branches. Just marks in the dirt. I told myself I was overthinking it, I wanted to believe that. I didn't have a gun with me, but I kept a fire poker near. Around evening, I heard the sound again. Thump, pause, thump thump, then quiet. I stepped outside without the flashlight. I let my eyes adjust and waited. The woods were still. I walked down the steps and stood at the edge of the dirt. The marks were there again, but something else caught my eye. Up in one of the trees, about 15 feet high, was a piece of cloth. It was dark, hanging from a low branch. It looked like it had been torn. I didn't remember seeing it earlier. It didn't look like something from nature. It looked like a sleeve. That was when I knew I wasn't alone. I went inside, locked the door, and pushed the couch in front of it. The generator was humming. The lights were still on. I didn't want to stay another night, but it was too late to drive. The roads would be too rough in the dark, and I was exhausted. I decided I'd leave at first light. I barely slept. I stayed sitting in a chair near the front door, poker in hand. The tapping didn't come again that night. It was quiet. The silence felt heavier than the noise. Just after dawn, I packed my bag, loaded the car, and got ready to go. Before I left, I walked once more around the cabin. The marks were still there. More of them now. They circled the cabin, not just one side. That was enough. I drove out fast, checking the rearview mirror the whole way. I didn't stop until I hit the first gas station back in town. When I got home, I emailed the owner of the cabin. I told them about the marks, the noise, the cloth. They didn't reply. A few weeks later, I checked the listing again. It was gone. I tried searching for the property, the lake, anything close by. Nothing showed up. No real records, like it was just gone. I still think about those nights, about what might have been in the woods watching. Whatever it was patient. It didn't need to rush. It just watched and waited and circled. I don't know what it wanted, but I know I wasn't supposed to be there. I haven't been back to the woods since. I still don't sleep well when it's quiet. And every now and then, when I walk by dirt trails or heavy woods, I check for marks. I haven't seen any yet. I took a trip up north to spend some time alone in a rented cabin. I had been dealing with a lot of stress at work and needed a break from the noise and pressure of everyday life. I booked a remote cabin in the northern woods, far from any major towns, about a 6-hour drive from home. It was early November, just before the heavy snows, and the area was already quiet and nearly empty of tourists. The drive up was long and tiring. The highway slowly gave way to smaller roads, then gravel paths that twisted through thick pine forests. My phone had lost signal about an hour before I even got close to the cabin. That was fine. I had come to get away from everything, and the lack of reception actually felt like a relief. I reached the cabin around late afternoon. It was a simple wooden structure, old but in decent shape. It stood about 30 yards from a small lake, with trees all around. The cabin had 2 rooms, a main room with a wood stove, a couch, and a kitchen area, and a small bedroom with a single bed. There was a small outhouse about 50 feet from the cabin. No electricity, no running water. It was exactly what I had been looking for. I spent the first day settling in. I brought enough canned food, bottled water, and firewood for a full week. I checked the windows, locked the doors, and took a short walk around the area. It was peaceful, just the sound of wind moving through trees and the occasional call of a bird. That night, it got cold fast. I started a fire in the stove and bundled up under a few thick blankets. I read by flashlight for a while and went to bed early. Sleep came slowly, though. I wasn't used to the silence. It was the kind of quiet that made you hear everything. Every creak of the old cabin, every shifting gust of wind. Sometime after midnight, I heard a faint crunching sound outside. It was soft and slow, like footsteps on dried leaves. I sat up and listened. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer. I told myself not to worry, but the sound didn't fade. It circled the cabin slowly, step by step, a deliberate pace. Then it stopped near the back wall. I held my breath. My flashlight was beside me, but I didn't want to turn it on. I just sat there in the dark, listening. Then I heard the faintest scrape against the wooden siding. Just one long, slow drag. I stayed awake until sunrise, heart pounding. I didn't go outside until it was fully light. When I finally stepped out, everything looked normal. I walked around the cabin, checking the ground. There were no clear footprints, but the dried leaves and pine needles had been disturbed in places. I couldn't tell what had made the marks. Could have been wind, I told myself. The rest of the day was uneventful. I kept myself busy, cut some more firewood, made simple meals, read more. But the memory of the night kept creeping back. I kept glancing out the windows, checking the edges of the woods. That night, I made sure the fire was strong and the cabin was warm. I tried to sleep early again, but sleep didn't come easy. The same silence wrapped around the cabin. Every sound felt louder. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. The crunching of leaves. Slow, steady steps. This time, I grabbed my flashlight. I moved to the front window and shone the light outside. The beam lit up the trees, but I didn't see anything. Still, the footsteps continued. Then they stopped. A moment later, I heard a sharp knock, 3 quick taps on the back wall of the cabin. I didn't sleep that night either. By morning, I was exhausted and uneasy. I walked the perimeter again. This time, I noticed something odd. A small pile of rocks had been stacked neatly near the corner of the cabin. It wasn't there the day before. I didn't know what it meant. Maybe just some old debris, but it looked fresh, purposeful. That day, I debated packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was overthinking things. Maybe it was just wildlife. Maybe I was imagining the knocking. I decided to stay one more night. I spent that day on edge, checking the woods constantly, never letting my flashlight out of reach. I skipped reading and just sat by the stove, listening. That night, it started earlier. Around 11 p.m., I heard the crunching. Then more knocking, slow, deliberate. For knocks this time, I didn't go outside. I just sat near the stove, flashlight in hand, waiting. After a while, the sounds stopped, or I thought they did. I went to the window again and looked out. That's when I saw something. Just at the edge of the trees. A shape, person maybe, standing very still. Too far to make out clearly, but close enough that I could see they weren't moving. They stood there for maybe 20 minutes, not making a sound. Then they stepped back into the trees. I barely slept. I kept the fire going and sat in a chair by the window until the sky began to lighten. That morning, I made the decision to leave. I packed my gear quickly. As I loaded my stuff into the car, I glanced toward the treeline. There was nothing there, but when I walked around the cabin one last time, I found another small pile of rocks. This time, there was a stick placed upright in the center. Felt like a message. The drive back was tense. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror. I didn't stop for food. I didn't stop for gas until I was well past the edge of the forest. Back home, I felt better, safer. But even now, months later, I still think about that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't know what the rocks meant. All I know is something was watching me, and it didn't want me there. I never told anyone the full story. People don't understand things like this unless they experience it. I don't plan on going back to that area again. I still get chills thinking about those slow footsteps circling the cabin in the dark. And the worst part is knowing I'll never have an answer. Not really. All I can do is remember and make sure I never end up alone in a place like that again. I needed a break from work and city life, so I booked a remote cabin in the northern part of Montana for 10 days. I'd found it online after a few hours of searching. It was a small wooden place, about 25 minutes from the nearest road, deep in the forest with no nearby neighbors. It didn't have Wi-Fi and the cell signal was weak. That was exactly what I wanted. Just me, the trees, and some quiet. I left early in the morning and drove for most of the day. The roads got worse the farther I went, turning from highway to narrow, cracked roads, and then to rough gravel. After a while, I had to slow down to avoid damaging the undercarriage of my car. By the time I reached the dirt path that led to the cabin, the sun was starting to go down, casting a soft orange light through the thick woods. The trees were tall and dense, and their tops swayed slowly in the wind. The cabin itself was simple and old. It had a small porch, one window in the front, and a single wooden door. It looked like it had been there for decades. Inside, there was a single room with a wood stove in one corner, a small bed against the wall, a table, 2 chairs, and some cabinets for dry food. There was a solar-powered battery setup for basic lights, but no fridge. I brought a cooler and packed enough food and supplies to last more than 10 days. There was a well outside with a hand pump and an outhouse about 50 yards behind the trees. The first night was calm. I built a fire in the stove, ate some canned soup, and read a paperback book until I got sleepy. It was pitch black outside. You couldn't see anything past the trees. I felt good. No sounds of traffic, no buzz of city lights, just silence and wind. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a trail that led down to a stream and a small hill that gave a better view of the forest. I took some pictures, collected firewood, and checked my supplies. Everything felt normal, peaceful. I liked being disconnected. That night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound outside. It was like dry twigs snapping. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other animal, but then I heard it again. It sounded closer. I sat up in bed, my heart beating a little faster. I didn't have a gun, but I had a hunting knife and a hatchet. I stayed still and listened. After a minute, the noise stopped. I waited longer and eventually went back to sleep. The next morning, I looked around outside. I didn't see anything unusual. Maybe it had been a raccoon or something. I shook it off. The third and fourth days went by quietly. I kept to my routine short hikes, reading, cooking simple meals. But at night, I started hearing those noises again. More twigs breaking, footsteps in the dry leaves. Sometimes I'd hear it off to the side of the cabin, sometimes in the back. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, maybe deer or a bear passing by. But bears are loud, and they usually don't come near people unless they smell food. I kept the cooler inside and locked tight. I didn't leave any food scraps outside. Something about the pattern of the noises felt off. It was always at night, always slow, like someone walking and stopping. By the 5th night, I was on edge. I barely slept. I kept the hatchet beside the bed. That night, I didn't just hear twigs breaking. I heard a soft thud on the side of the cabin wall. It was just one, like someone pressing a hand or foot against it. I held my breath and sat still in bed for what felt like an hour. My ears strained for any sound, but it didn't come again. The next day, I found something strange. Behind the cabin, about 10 feet from the wall, the grass and leaves looked like they had been trampled. There were clear marks in the dirt. They weren't clear footprints, but more like spots where someone had stood, turned, and walked. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't explain it. I didn't hear or see anyone leave. There was no vehicle, no tire tracks. That day, I considered leaving, but I'd paid for the whole trip, and a part of me didn't want to overreact. Maybe I was letting my mind play tricks on me. I decided to stay, but I changed how I spent the day. I sharpened the hatchet, set up a small perimeter with tied cans to make noise if someone approached, and didn't go far from the cabin. I even covered the cooler with a blanket and pushed it under the table. That night, I didn't light the stove. I stayed in bed in the dark, listening. Around midnight, the cans I tied clinked together lightly. My body froze. I gripped the hatchet and waited. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no knock. I waited for almost an hour before I crept over to the window and looked out. I didn't see anyone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The 7th day, I found something else. A dead rabbit near the edge of the trees. Its neck was broken clean. It wasn't torn up like a predator had gotten to it. It looked like it had been placed there. That was the tipping point for me. I packed most of my stuff and made sure everything was ready to go. I didn't want to hike out in the dark, so I planned to leave at sunrise. That night, I heard the cans again. But this time, they rattled hard, like someone kicked them. I stood in the dark holding the hatchet, listening to fast footsteps in the dry leaves outside. Then silence. I waited. Maybe 15 minutes later, I heard the back door of the outhouse creak open. I never used the back door. It had been locked with a chain when I first got there. I didn't even open it. I stayed up all night. At first light, I grabbed my bag, the hatchet, and got in my car. I started it up and drove out, heart pounding. I didn't look back. The drive back to the main road felt longer than it had on the way in. I kept checking the rearview mirror. Nothing followed me. When I got to town, I went straight to a diner and had breakfast. I sat there for almost 2 hours just watching people walk by. I thought about telling someone, maybe the sheriff, but what would I even say? That I heard noises? That someone might have walked around my cabin in the woods? That I found a dead rabbit? Sounded thin. I didn't have proof. Still, something wasn't right out there. Someone knew I was staying alone. Someone watched me. They never came into the cabin. They didn't try to hurt me, not directly, but they wanted me scared. Maybe they did it for fun. Or maybe they were waiting for me to stay longer. When I got home, I deleted the listing from my browser history. I didn't leave a review. I never went back. That was almost 2 years ago. Since then, I haven't stayed in a cabin alone again. Not in the woods. Not where there's no one around. I've kept the hatchet. It's in the trunk of my car even now, just in case. I still don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I think they would have done more if I had stayed just one more night. I trust my gut now. When something feels wrong, I don't wait. I leave, because sometimes you're not alone, even when you think you are. I was 34 when I decided to take some time off from everything. Work had worn me down. I'd just gone through a breakup that felt like it drained every part of me. Life in the city didn't feel right anymore. Everything felt loud, fast, and fake. I didn't tell many people, but I was on the edge. Not suicidal or anything, but just tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. I wanted to go somewhere quiet, somewhere far, just me and nothing else. I booked a remote cabin up in northern Pennsylvania, near an old disused rock quarry. It was one of those places that used to have some logging business decades ago but had been forgotten by time. Now it was mostly forest, empty cabins, some dirt trails, and a few locals who'd lived there their whole lives. The place I found was a one-bedroom cabin with no Wi-Fi and spotty phone service. It was listed as perfect for solo reflection. That's what I was looking for. Took me 6 hours to drive up from Philly. The last hour was on winding roads with no streetlights, just trees pressing in on both sides. I had to slow to 20 miles an hour in some places because the road was narrow and full of potholes. There were no other cars, no lights, just my headlights carving through the dark. The GPS cut out 20 minutes from the cabin, but I downloaded the map. I found the turnoff, a narrow dirt path that looked more like a deer trail than a road, and followed it for another mile until I saw the cabin. It was smaller than it looked in the photos, built low to the ground with dark brown wood and a tin roof. There was a tiny porch, a fire pit out front, and a few broken down chairs scattered around. The trees were packed in tight behind the cabin, but in front, there was a clearing that led out toward a small ridge. Just beyond that, maybe 200 yards out, was the old quarry. You couldn't see it from the cabin, but you could hear it faintly if the wind was right. Just this low, hollow hum like air moving through a pipe. I didn't think much of it at the time. I got inside and checked the place out. One room with a bed, a wood stove, a table, and a little kitchen area. The bathroom was outside, just a wooden outhouse about 30 feet from the back of the cabin. No running water. The sink inside was hooked to a plastic jug system that you had to refill yourself. The place smelled like dry wood and mouse droppings, but it was clean enough. It felt separate from the world. That's what I wanted. I spent the first day unpacking and gathering firewood from around the property. The air smelled sharp and cold. The wind made the trees sway with deep creaks that sounded like old ships. That night, I cooked some canned chili, drank a beer, and sat by the fire outside. There was no light anywhere, no glow from towns, no cars on roads, just black sky and stars and the sounds of the woods. I went to bed early and slept hard. The next few days followed a rhythm. I'd wake up early, make instant coffee on the little camp stove, then take long walks along the dirt trails that ran through the woods. The trails weren't marked, but I had a good sense of direction. I avoided the quarry at first, partly because I didn't know how safe it was and partly because I didn't care. I was here to be away from things, not to sightsee. By day 5, I started to notice weird things. Small at first. I'd stack firewood beside the porch, and the next morning it would be scattered like someone had kicked it. I thought maybe animals were getting into it, so I stacked it again more neatly and placed a few heavy stones on top. The next day, it was scattered again. The stones were on the ground 10 feet away. That made me pause. I started to pay more attention. I left my boots on the porch one night. In the morning, they were wet. Not rained on wet, but like someone had dunked them in a stream. I thought I was being paranoid, but I moved them inside after that. Then I started hearing sounds at night. Not the usual forest sounds. These were sharper. Thudding, scraping, something like a shovel being dragged across rocks. Once I woke up around 3 a.m. and heard a dull banging sound coming from the direction of the quarry. I looked out the window, but I couldn't see anything, just black trees. I figured it might be local kids messing around. Maybe someone who didn't like out-of-towners staying on their land. I thought about driving back into town and asking around, but the nearest gas station was 25 minutes away and only open during the day. I didn't want to start something with the locals, so I let it go. I stayed alert, though. On day 7, I finally went down toward the quarry. It had been bothering me. I needed to see it. I followed the trail that led out past the ridge and down into a rocky basin. The path ended at a rusted-out metal fence, mostly collapsed. I stepped over it and saw the quarry below. It was bigger than I thought. A huge open pit, maybe 100 feet down, with jagged layers of rock running around the edges like a stadium. At the bottom, there was water, dark, still, and almost oily looking. A few rusted machines sat half-sunken near the edge. Cranes, diggers, stripped of anything useful. There was graffiti on the rocks, beer bottles, broken chairs, signs that people came here probably to party. But it felt off. Even standing in daylight, I felt like I shouldn't be there. There were no animals, no birds, not even insects buzzing around. It was dead quiet, except for the occasional groan of wind against the stone. I stayed maybe 10 minutes and walked back fast, feeling eyes on me the whole time. That night, I didn't sleep well. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something heavy hit the side of the cabin. Not a knock, not an animal. A full thud, like someone throwing a log. I sat up and listened. A few seconds later, there was another one. Then another. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the window. I didn't see anything, just trees and blackness. My heart was beating hard, but I told myself it could be branches falling. Wind, something dumb. The next morning, I saw dents in the wall. 3 of them, each the size of a grapefruit. The marks were low to the ground, maybe knee-height. Whatever hit the wall didn't leave anything behind. No wood, no rocks, just dents in the planks. I felt this cold tighten in my stomach. I considered leaving. I had enough food to last a few more days, but I wasn't sleeping, and I didn't feel safe. Still, a part of me didn't want to give up. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself. Maybe I just didn't want to go back to my old life yet. Either way, I stayed. The next day, I walked the perimeter of the property, looking for signs of other people. I found some strange things. A tree with deep claw marks, not bear claws, something sharper and narrower. A small pile of bones near a mossy log, squirrel or rabbit, but picked completely clean. I found a path I hadn't noticed before, leading down into a narrow gully behind the cabin. I followed it for a few hundred feet and came across something I'll never forget. It was a campsite, or what used to be one. There was a blue tent, collapsed and half buried in leaves, a rusted-out lantern, an old folding chair broken in half. But what got me was the backpack. It was sitting upright, clean, no dirt on it, like it had just been placed there. I opened it. Inside were a few water bottles, a notebook, and a phone. The phone was dead, but the notebook had writing in it. Just one line over and over, "Don't stay past the 9th night." It was written maybe 50 times, all in the same shaky handwriting. My mouth went dry. I took the notebook and hurried back to the cabin. That night was the worst. I locked the door, dragged the table in front of it, and kept my hatchet beside the bed. I didn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard something moving around the cabin, not just walking, dragging, like it was pulling something heavy behind it. Then I heard scratching at the walls. Slow, steady, not random, like it was tracing the edges of the building. Around 3 a.m., I swear I heard breathing just outside the window. Long, deep breaths. I didn't move until daylight. On the 9th morning, I packed everything. I didn't care about my schedule. I didn't care about the rest of the food. I stuffed it all into the car, threw the gear in the back, and got ready to leave. But the car wouldn't start. The battery was dead. I hadn't left the lights on. It had worked fine the day before. I tried again. Nothing. The starter didn't even click. My hands were shaking. I popped the hood and checked the battery. The cables were gone. Clean cut, like someone had taken bolt cutters to them. I stood there for a long time, not knowing what to do. I had no phone signal. The nearest town was 20 miles away. I had food, water, but no way to call for help. I could wait and hope someone came up the road, but I hadn't seen a car in days. My only choice was to walk. I packed light, took water, some food, my flashlight, and the hatchet. I left the rest. I didn't take the trail. I followed the dirt road out the way I came. It was slow going. My boots were heavy. The road was uphill. I kept checking over my shoulder. Every crack in the trees made me jump. Every sound felt like something catching up to me. I walked for hours, 5, maybe 6. My legs were burning. Then I saw a pickup truck. I needed a break from everything. Work had burned me out. My phone never stopped buzzing, and I couldn't even sleep properly anymore. I wasn't looking for fun or company or even anything special. I just wanted to get away from people. So when I saw an old off-grid cabin listed on a small rental site, I booked it without thinking twice. It was 3 hours from the city, deep in the northern woods, with no Wi-Fi, no phone signal, and no neighbors. Just trees, hills, and silence. It sounded perfect. I packed simple stuff. Food that didn't need a fridge, a flashlight, extra batteries, a basic first aid kit, and a big jug of water. I brought a small axe and some tools too, just in case. The cabin didn't have electricity or running water, so I knew I had to be ready. The ad said it had a small wood stove for heat and a gas burner for cooking. That was good enough for me. The drive up was long and quiet. After a while, even the radio stations dropped out. The road turned into gravel, and then it wasn't even a road anymore. Just 2 dirt tracks leading into thick trees. The last 10 minutes I was creeping along, careful not to hit a rock or get stuck. When I finally saw the cabin, I actually smiled. It was small, 1 room and a small porch with a rusty metal chimney poking out the top. The logs were dark with age, and the roof sagged a little, but it looked solid. There were no other houses around, just forest. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and breathed in that cold, clean air. I hadn't felt that calm in months. Inside was simple: a cot with a thin mattress, a small table and chair, shelves with some old supplies, and a stone fireplace. The gas burner was on a side table near a cabinet filled with mismatched pots. There was even an old metal sink with a bucket underneath to catch water. The windows were small and square, with latches that stuck a little when I tried them. I opened them to air the place out. I spent the first day settling in. I swept out the dust, chopped some wood, and unpacked. I tried not to think too much. That night, I built a small fire in the stove and sat on the porch with my flashlight off, listening to the sounds of the woods. Owls, wind through the trees, maybe a distant coyote. It was peaceful. I slept well, better than I had in a long time. No sirens, no buzzing phones, no streetlights. Just the dark and the cold and the silence. The next couple days followed the same rhythm. I hiked small trails around the cabin, collected fallen branches for firewood, and sat outside watching birds. I didn't do much. I didn't want to, but on the 4th night, things changed. I had turned in early. It was cold, so I had the fire going strong. I was reading by lantern light when I heard something outside. It was a sharp sound like a branch snapping, followed by a slower crunch. Then another. I thought maybe it was a deer. There were plenty around. I blew out the lantern and waited. More footsteps, closer this time. Not running, not sneaking, just walking, heavy, steady. I sat still, heart beating faster now. I had left the axe near the door. I reached for it slowly, not making a sound. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Full minute. Then two. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal and went to bed. But I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I looked around outside. There were tracks. Not boot prints exactly, but too big for any deer I knew. Almost human in size, but wider. I didn't like it. I checked the area more carefully. I found 3 more prints near the trees. Then they disappeared. I didn't know what to make of it. I tried to brush it off. Maybe a bear? A big one? But bears don't walk like that. Not so clean. Not in a line. I spent the day close to the cabin, keeping the axe near me. Nothing else happened. The woods were quiet again. But that night, I heard the steps again. They started far off. Then they came closer. Same slow, steady pace. Then they stopped right outside. I didn't breathe. I sat on the edge of the bed with the axe in both hands. I heard breathing, right outside the window. Then it walked around the cabin. 1 full circle. Each step was clear. Then it stopped again. Hours passed. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. When the sky finally got light, I went out. More tracks. Around the whole cabin. Same size. Same wide shape. No sign of where it had come from or gone. That was the last full day I planned to stay. I packed everything before noon. But I knew I had 1 more night to get through. I didn't want to drive out in the dark over those rough roads. I set up small things to make me feel better. Pans by the door that would fall if kicked, extra wood inside so I didn't need to go out, and the axe in my hand the whole time. That night was dead silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Until midnight, I heard the sound again. Steps, slow, crunch, crunch, crunch. Then it stopped, right outside. Then the sound of something dragging, something sliding across the porch. I held my breath. It dragged something again. Then a thud, like something heavy dropped against the wall. I didn't move, didn't blink. Then, for the first time, it touched the door. Just a tap. Then a slow push. The wood creaked, but the latch held. It didn't try again. Eventually, I must have blacked out from exhaustion. When I opened my eyes, it was morning. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bag and got out. I didn't look around. I just got in the car and drove. The path was rough, but I didn't stop. Not once. When I reached a gas station an hour later, I finally felt like I could breathe. I didn't report it. Who would I even report it to? What would I say? But I did go back to the listing site. The cabin was gone. Not marked as rented. Just gone. Like it was never listed. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't think it was an animal. I never saw it. But I felt it. And I know it was watching me. It wasn't curious. It wasn't scared. It was just waiting. I never went back to the woods after that. And I never will. I hadn't taken a real break in over 2 years. My job kept me in front of a screen day and night, handling complaints, meetings, deadlines that never ended. I knew I needed to disconnect. So when I saw an old off-the-grid cabin listed for short-term rental deep in northern Minnesota, I booked it without thinking twice. The photos showed a small, beat-up wooden cabin tucked into the woods, about 40 minutes from the nearest paved road. No cell signal, no internet. Exactly what I needed. I packed up my small truck and drove up there in late October. The trees were bare, wind already sharp with cold. I had a couple bins of canned food, bottled water, a generator, extra gas, some tools and winter gear. I figured I'd hike a little, sleep a lot, and maybe try to remember what it felt like not to be stressed 24/7. The drive to the cabin was quiet. After the last stretch of road, I followed a narrow dirt trail lined with thick pine and birch. Fallen leaves made it a little slippery in spots, but I managed fine. After about 25 minutes of bumping and swerving, I came around a bend and saw the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, set on uneven ground with a slight lean to one side. There was a little porch, a rusted metal roof, and a padlocked door. The key worked fine. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and dust. There was one main room with a small wood stove, a creaky cot in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and some shelves with mismatched supplies. Some old canned goods, a first aid kit, candles, a hatchet, and some firewood stacked along the wall. The small bathroom was outside, 100 feet behind the cabin, just a rickety outhouse with a broken door. I didn't care. It was quiet. I felt good. I settled in that first day, lit a fire in the stove, and walked a bit around the clearing. There was no one around for miles. The silence was complete. No engines, no chatter, not even planes above. That night, I slept like I hadn't in years. The second day, I explored deeper into the woods. I marked my trail with a compass and small colored tags I brought. I followed an old deer trail that curved around a ridge and led down to a stream. The air was cool, and the only sound was the wind pushing through dry leaves. I saw some old animal tracks near the stream. Likely deer, maybe a fox or something smaller. I stayed out for about 3 hours, then headed back before dark. On the way back, I got turned around for a moment. It wasn't panic, just confusion. Everything looked the same. I followed my markers but noticed one was missing. I kept walking and eventually spotted a broken branch I remembered. When I got back to the cabin, I made a note to not wander too far from now on. I also started carving little symbols into nearby trees to supplement the plastic tags. That night I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a light scraping against the side of the cabin. I figured it was a tree branch in the wind, but when I checked in the morning, there weren't any branches near that wall, just scratch marks on the wood. Not deep, but wide. I told myself it was probably some animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear sniffing around. But bears were mostly in hibernation now, and the marks were strange. Still, I let it go. I had come here to relax. Over the next couple of days, little things started to feel off. My tool bag was moved from the corner to under the cot. I hadn't touched it. A can of soup I left on the table was missing. One morning, the firewood pile was smaller by about 4 or 5 logs. I figured maybe I miscounted, or I moved stuff around and forgot. I wasn't sleeping great anymore. The wind picked up hard at night, and even though I kept the stove going, the cold woke me up every few hours. I started seeing shapes in the woods. Not people, just shadows or dark shapes between trees, standing still. Whenever I looked directly at them, they were gone. Could have been trees. Could have been my eyes playing tricks. One afternoon, while chopping wood, I heard a branch snap deep in the woods, like something heavy stepped on it. I froze. The woods were too quiet after that. No birds, no wind, just still. The next day, I stayed near the cabin. I checked my supplies again. Some food was missing, a bottle of water too. I always kept things in the same place, and now stuff was gone. I locked the door at night. Even though there were no windows big enough to crawl through, I jammed a chair under the knob and kept the hatchet beside the cot. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. Something had knocked over the chair I put under the door. The fire was still glowing. I could see the door was closed, still locked, but the chair was on its side across the room. I got up, checked everything, even went outside with a flashlight. Nothing, just the trees creaking in the wind. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up with the hatchet in my lap, listening. I kept hearing faint crunches in the leaves outside, like footsteps, but they were slow. Far away, then closer, then silence. The following morning, I decided to pack up and leave. I didn't care that I had a few days left. I didn't feel safe. I started loading up the truck when I saw something in the tree line. It was a man standing still between 2 pines, wearing dark clothes. He didn't move. I froze. He was too far for me to see his face. I called out, but of course there was no answer. Then he turned and walked deeper into the trees. Just like that, quiet and slow. I didn't chase. I threw the rest of my stuff into the truck. Didn't care what I left behind. I drove down that dirt trail faster than I should have. The branches scraped the sides, and I hit a stump hard enough to bend something in the suspension, but I didn't stop. When I got back to the highway, I pulled into a gas station and sat there for a long time. I told myself it could have been a hunter, maybe someone living off-grid. But why sneak around? Why not talk? And how did he get into the cabin to move stuff? I didn't call the cops. I didn't want to sound crazy. I just drove home. For days, I kept thinking about that scratching sound, the missing supplies, the man in the woods. Whoever he was, he'd been watching me, coming close when I slept, maybe even inside while I was out. The worst part was knowing how deep into nowhere that cabin was. Whoever was out there had to be living in those woods. He knew every trail, every ridge, every hollow. I was just a temporary guest in his backyard. I never went back. I never looked up that listing again. I deleted the photos from my phone. But sometimes, I still wake up at night, thinking I hear that faint scratching. And I get up, check every door, every window, just in case. It started with an ad I saw online. Someone was renting out a remote cabin up in the northern mountains for a week. Cheap. It looked old but solid, and they promised working plumbing, heating, and electricity. I had some vacation days saved up, and honestly, I just needed to be alone for a bit. Work had been burning me out. Everything in the city felt loud and rushed. I wanted silence. I wanted to hear the wind in the trees, nothing more. The road up to the cabin wasn't easy. My small sedan struggled on the gravel paths, and I had to drive slower the higher I got. There were no houses nearby. Once I passed the last gas station in the small town 20 miles back, it was just me and the trees. My cell signal dropped around the same time. I didn't care. That was the point. When I got to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sky was gray, heavy with the kind of clouds that don't quite rain but hang there like they might. The place looked even more isolated than I imagined. No neighboring cabins, no cars, just trees. Pines mostly tall and close together. The cabin itself was simple. 1 floor, 2 rooms, a small kitchen area, a living space with a wood stove, and a back bedroom with a creaky but solid bed. There was a bathroom too, thankfully, with an old toilet and a small standing shower. I unpacked the cooler I brought, set my sleeping bag on the bed even though there were blankets, and lit a fire in the stove just for comfort. The first night was calm. I sat on the porch for hours just listening to the wind in the trees. By the second day, I had already adjusted. I slept longer than usual, drank coffee on the porch, went for short walks through the trees around the cabin. I didn't go too far, just made a few loops nearby. I brought a compass, not because I thought I'd get lost, but out of habit. There were animal tracks in the dirt, deer mostly, maybe a fox. No bears, which was good. I hadn't brought a gun, just a small knife and a can of bear spray. On the third night, I woke up because I thought I heard something. A thump, just one. I lay in bed listening. It was quiet, too quiet. I got up, checked the stove, the door, the windows. Everything was locked. The thump could have been a log in the fire shifting. I told myself that and went back to bed. Still, I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I noticed something that didn't sit right with me. The small welcome mat outside the door had been shifted. It wasn't a big thing, just turned slightly. Could have been the wind. But the mat was heavy, and the night hadn't been windy. I looked around but didn't see anything. No footprints, no broken branches. I went back inside and told myself I was just being paranoid. That evening, I went for a walk again, a longer one. Maybe I needed the movement to calm myself. I followed a slope downhill, found a dried creek bed, and sat there for a while. It was peaceful. Still, on the way back, maybe 50 yards from the cabin, I saw something strange. A tree trunk had fresh scratches on it, deep ones like something had clawed at it. I stared at them for a long time, too wide for a fox or raccoon, too clean for deer. They looked like knife marks. I felt cold all of a sudden, even though I was sweating. I didn't have a knife that big. I didn't know who would. I made it back to the cabin quickly, locked the door, closed the blinds. I kept the stove going even though it wasn't that cold. That night, I barely slept. I heard small sounds, a twig snap, something brushing against the porch. I kept the knife near me. Around 2 a.m., there was another thump, this time closer. It came from the wall behind the bed. I froze, didn't move, just listened, then silence. The next morning, I circled the cabin. That same wall had a smear on it. Dirt, maybe, or mud. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to get close. I felt watched. That's the only way I can describe it. Like something was out there. I didn't see anything in the woods, but it felt like something saw me. I should have left then, but I didn't. Part of me didn't want to be afraid. Part of me thought I was overreacting, so I stayed. I kept the knife with me at all times. I even slept with it under my pillow. The fifth night was the worst. It started with tapping, light at first, on the window above the sink, then louder, then nothing. I sat in the living room with no lights on, just the fire. Then something hit the side of the cabin, hard, a full-body thud like someone had run into it. Then it happened again, and again. From the other side, I stood up, grabbed the knife and didn't breathe. The sound stopped. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. Then I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, one step at a time. I didn't go to the door. I didn't speak. I just stood in the dark and listened. The footsteps stopped. I waited. I waited so long my legs cramped. Eventually, I sat on the floor, back to the wall, and stared at the door until the sky started to lighten. Then I moved. When I opened the door, nothing was there, but the mat was gone, just gone. I checked around the porch, the ground, even the bushes. Nothing. I packed my stuff, threw everything in the car. Didn't care about what spilled or broke. The only thing I left behind was a mug I dropped. I didn't even pick it up. The road out felt longer than I remembered. Every time a tree creaked or something moved in the bushes, I jumped. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. When I got back to town, I drove straight to a gas station and parked under the lights. I checked the car over. Scratches on the rear bumper. Long ones, deep, not from a branch, not from a rock. Something sharp, like a blade or claws. I didn't report it. What would I say? Someone scratched my car and stole my welcome mat? No one would believe the rest. Hell, I barely believed it. I went home, locked my apartment door, slept with the lights on for a week, told people the cabin trip was peaceful, quiet, just what I needed. But I still think about it. I think about those marks on the tree, the footsteps, the missing mat, the sounds. Someone was out there, or something. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was real, and it knew I was alone. It started with a break I didn't know I needed. My job had worn me down. I was working long hours in a small office, barely seeing the sun most days, and living off coffee and vending machine snacks. I felt like I was fading away. So when a friend of mine offered me a chance to use their family's old cabin up north for a week, I said yes without even thinking. I packed my things that night. I wanted to get away from people, noise, and screens. I just wanted trees, air, and silence. The drive took almost 7 hours. The road got narrower and rougher the farther I went. The last stretch was a dirt road with potholes and fallen branches. There were no signs, no houses, just forest all around. I had to stop and check my phone a few times to be sure I was still on the right path. The signal was weak, and I figured I might not have any service once I got there. The cabin sat at the edge of a small lake. It looked old but solid, a bit crooked, maybe like it had settled unevenly over the years. The roof had moss growing on it, and the steps creaked under my feet. Inside, it was dusty but cozy in a rustic way. There was a wood stove, a small kitchen with old appliances, and one bedroom with a creaky bed. No TV, no internet. The windows looked out into the woods, and the trees came right up to the back wall of the cabin. I dropped my bags and opened all the windows. The air smelled like pine and earth. I sat out on the front steps and just listened. I could hear birds, the wind in the trees, and nothing else. Felt perfect. The first day passed slowly. I read a little, chopped some firewood that was stacked under a tarp, and made myself a simple dinner. I went to bed early and slept deeply. No city sounds, no lights, just darkness and the soft lapping of the lake. The second day, I hiked along the lake. There was no real trail, just a rough path through the underbrush. I found old boot prints, maybe from someone else who stayed here recently. I saw animal tracks too, but nothing fresh. I kept walking until I reached the far side of the lake. The water was calm and clear. I sat on a rock for a long time just watching the ripples. Coming back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was shut. I had left it open to air the place out. I stopped, heart beating faster. Maybe the wind had blown it shut, or maybe not. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. Nothing, just the usual quiet. I went inside slowly. Nothing was moved. My stuff was where I left it. Still, I felt off, like someone had been here. That night, I locked the door. The third day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't want to hike. I kept glancing at the trees, thinking I saw movement, but every time I looked, it was just branches. I told myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't used to this kind of silence. My brain was filling in blanks. Still, I stayed alert. That afternoon, I found a knife outside, a large hunting knife. It was stuck in a tree stump a few feet from the porch. I hadn't seen it before. It wasn't rusty, but it didn't look new either. I didn't own it. I picked it up carefully. The handle was worn smooth. I brought it inside and locked the door again. That night, I woke up to a sound, a soft thud, then another. I lay still, eyes open. I could hear the wind outside, and then a soft scraping sound. I sat up, heart racing. I got out of bed and moved slowly to the window. I stayed low and looked out. I couldn't see anything, just trees and shadows. I waited. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I walked around the cabin, looking for signs of animals or people. I found nothing. No footprints, no damage. I felt uneasy all day. I carried the knife with me, even inside. I kept thinking maybe I should leave, but I told myself I was overreacting. Just a city guy not used to being alone in the woods. That evening, I built a fire in the stove and made a bigger dinner. I tried to push the thoughts away. I ate, read a few chapters of a book, then sat by the fire until it burned low. I checked all the windows, made sure the door was locked, and went to bed with the knife on the nightstand. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the porch. They were slow and heavy. I froze in bed. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped near the door. Then nothing. I waited. After a long minute, I got up and crept to the window. I moved the curtain just a little. I couldn't see anyone. I checked the other window. Same thing. I sat down and waited. I didn't hear anything else that night. In the morning, I found boot prints on the porch. They were muddy and large, too big to be mine. They came from the woods, stopped at the door, then went back. I packed my bag. I didn't care if it was just a hunter or someone lost. I didn't want to stay another night. I loaded my gear into the car and started driving. The road was rough and I was driving faster than I should have been. I just wanted to get out of there. About a mile from the cabin, I had to stop. A tree had fallen across the road. A big one, too big to move by myself. I sat in the car, heart pounding. I looked around. The forest was still. I backed up and turned around. There was a small dirt path branching off a few hundred feet back. I didn't remember seeing it on the way in, but maybe it led to the highway. I didn't have much choice. The path was narrow, with low branches scraping the sides of the car. I followed it for maybe a mile, then it ended in a clearing. No exit, no road, just the remains of an old shed, collapsed and half covered in vines. I turned off the engine. I felt trapped. I got out and looked around. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I walked back down the path on foot to check the main road again. When I got to the tree, I saw something new. The tree had been cut, not fallen, cut cleanly at the base with a saw or axe. There were fresh wood shavings on the ground. Someone had blocked the road on purpose. I ran back to the car. I locked the doors and sat there trying to think. I didn't have a signal. I couldn't call anyone. I didn't have food or water with me. Everything was still at the cabin. I waited a few hours. Nothing happened, just silence. I finally decided to walk back to the cabin. I didn't want to, but I didn't know what else to do. I followed the dirt road slowly, watching the trees. When I got back, the cabin door was open. I stopped and stared. I had locked it. I knew I had. I crept closer, knife in hand. The inside was a mess. Drawers pulled out, books on the floor, mattress flipped. Someone had gone through everything. I backed away and hid in the trees. I waited, watching. After an hour, nothing happened. I moved closer and checked the inside again. Nothing was missing, just tossed around. I packed a small bag with water, food, and a flashlight. I took a jacket and put on my boots. I wasn't going to sleep here. I left just before sunset. I followed the lake around, heading in the direction I thought the highway might be. I didn't know for sure, but I couldn't stay. I walked for hours. The woods got thicker, and the ground was uneven. I tripped more than once. My legs were tired, and it was getting cold. I found a rock outcrop and rested. I ate some food, drank water, and waited. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I stayed awake most of the night, listening. I heard distant sounds, twigs snapping, maybe animals, maybe not. The first light, I started walking again. I moved fast, trying to stay ahead of whatever was out there. By late morning, I heard cars, the sound of engines. I pushed through the trees and stumbled onto a logging road. I flagged down a truck. The driver was surprised to see me. I told him I had gotten lost while hiking. He gave me water and a ride to a ranger station. I didn't tell them everything. I just said I got turned around and my car got stuck. They helped me arrange a tow and get back to town. Later, I went online and searched for anything about the cabin. There wasn't much, just a few posts from people who had stayed there. One mentioned hearing noises. One said their car had been tampered with. None of them had stayed more than a few days. I never went back. I sold my car. I moved to a new place. I still go into nature sometimes, but not alone, not without a signal, and never near that lake. Looking back, I know someone had been watching me. They knew the area, knew how to cut me off, scare me, force me back. I don't know what they wanted, but they didn't get it. I got out. I was lucky, and I don't need to be lucky again. It started as a simple plan. I wanted a break from everything. I had been working nonstop for nearly 3 years, bouncing between jobs that drained the life out of me. I didn't have any real vacation in all that time. So when my cousin told me about an old cabin he used to go to with his friends in northern Michigan, deep in the woods near a small lake, I decided that was where I needed to be. Total isolation. Just me, a cabin, and the trees. Took me nearly 10 hours to get there from Chicago. I left early in the morning, and by the time I made it through the narrow dirt roads that wound through the trees like veins, the sun was already setting. The cabin looked old but strong, weathered but not rotting. It was made of thick logs and sat on a small hill that overlooked the lake. There was a single gravel path leading down to a little dock. No neighbors, no cell service, no traffic noise, just the wind in the trees and the soft sound of water. I parked my car beside the cabin and started unloading. I brought enough supplies for a week. Food, water, sleeping bag, my camping gear, an axe, a small propane stove, a few books, and my laptop in case I wanted to write. The cabin had no electricity, but it had a fireplace and a hand pump outside for water. I didn't mind roughing it. That was the whole point. The first night went by fine. I lit a fire in the hearth, cooked some instant noodles, and sat by the flames reading until my eyes couldn't stay open. The bed inside had a thin mattress and smelled like dust, but I had my sleeping bag. I fell asleep fast and woke up to the sound of birds outside. It was peaceful. Still, the first few days followed that same rhythm. I went for walks around the lake, chopped firewood, sat on the dock with my feet in the water, and read. I didn't see a single person or even hear another engine. It was the most alone I had ever felt, and I loved it. The air smelled clean, like pine and wet dirt. The water in the lake was so clear I could see small fish swimming beneath the surface. On the fourth night, something changed. It was a small thing at first. I noticed the door was open when I woke up. I was sure I had closed it. It had a heavy latch that creaked when it moved, and I didn't remember hearing it open during the night. I figured maybe I hadn't latched it properly. It was windy that night, and maybe the gusts had blown it open. I didn't think much of it. But the next night, I noticed my flashlight was missing. I had left it on the small table near the front door, and when I went to grab it after the sun had gone down, it was gone. I looked around the entire cabin, even checked my backpack and under the bed. Nothing. That was harder to explain. I always kept it in the same spot. I told myself maybe I had carried it somewhere and dropped it during the day. Maybe near the dock. The following morning, I walked around looking for it. I checked the trail around the lake, the spot where I chopped wood, and near the dock. Still nothing. Then I saw something else. My axe, which I always left stuck in the stump outside, was lying flat in the dirt about 20 feet away. It looked like it had been thrown. The handle had mud on it like it had landed hard. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, thinking I heard noises outside. I kept telling myself it was animals. Raccoons maybe, or deer. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I didn't have any way to contact anyone. My phone had no signal and the nearest town was at least an hour away. By the sixth night, I was jumpy. Every noise made me sit up in bed. The wind tapping branches against the windows made my skin crawl. I finally drifted off around 2 a.m., exhausted. When I woke up, the door was wide open again. This time, the firewood I had stacked neatly by the fireplace was scattered across the floor. I stood there staring at it for a long time, my heart racing. That day, I decided to cut my trip short. I packed everything. My food, clothes, camping gear, all of it. I was ready to get out of there by early evening. I went out to the car and put the key in the ignition. The engine didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. I checked the hood. I knew a little about engines. The battery cables had been pulled loose. Not just popped off, but yanked out. I stared at them, my breath catching. Someone had done this. No animal could have. I reattached the cables and the engine roared to life. I felt sick. I didn't even bother securing anything properly. I jumped in and started driving back the way I came. Fast. The road was rough and narrow. After a few miles, I had to slow down or risk sliding off the trail. That's when I saw something in the road. A pile of branches stacked high, blocking the way, like someone had gone out and gathered them on purpose. I slammed the brakes and got out. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I pulled the pile apart as fast as I could. I didn't care about scratches or bruises. I just needed to get past. It took about 10 minutes to clear enough space. I jumped back in the car and drove. I didn't stop for anything. Not when a deer ran across the road. Not when a tire hit a sharp rock. I didn't breathe easy until I saw the highway again. When I got home, I couldn't sleep for days. I kept thinking about the open doors, the missing flashlight, the moved axe. Someone was out there, watching me, maybe even walking into the cabin at night while I slept. I had no idea what they wanted, or why they didn't do anything worse. Maybe they were just playing with me. Maybe they were building up to something. I never went back. I didn't even tell my cousin what happened. I just said I wanted something closer to home next time. I still don't know who was out there or what they were planning. But I know one thing, I was not alone. And I don't think I was ever supposed to find that out. It was early October when I decided to take a week off and head to a small rental cabin in the middle of northern Michigan. I had found the place through an old coworker who mentioned it once during lunch. He said it was quiet, far from town, and cheap because the owners barely advertised it anymore. That sounded perfect to me. I'd been working nonstop for months, sleeping late, skipping meals, and feeling drained every morning. I wanted silence. No phone, no people, no schedules. Just a break from everything. The drive took most of the day. The roads grew narrower the farther north I went, and by the time I reached the last hour of the trip, I was following a gravel road through dense woods with no signs or cell service. The trees on either side leaned in toward the road, and the only sounds were the tires crunching over stone and the occasional squirrel darting across the path. I followed the directions my coworker had given me, turning left at a barely visible mailbox and following a trail even rougher than the last. Eventually, the trees opened up slightly, and there it was, the cabin. It looked exactly like the photos, small, wooden, with a slanted roof, one window on each side, and a little porch out front with two old chairs. There was no sign of anyone around. No nearby homes, no driveways, no fences. Just forest in every direction. Felt peaceful. Inside was simple but clean. A small kitchen with an old gas stove, a table with 2 chairs, a single bed against the far wall, and a narrow bathroom with an old tub. The lights worked, powered by a propane generator out back, and there was a wood-burning stove for heat. The windows had screens but no curtains, and the floor creaked under my feet. I spent the first day unpacking and settling in. I chopped some wood using the dull axe out back, stocked it near the stove, and heated a can of soup for dinner. That night, I sat out on the porch, listening to the sounds of the woods. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It was exactly what I needed. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was an old path that led deeper into the woods. It was mostly overgrown but still walkable. I followed it for about half an hour before turning back. I didn't bring a map, and the trees all looked the same. I didn't want to risk getting lost. When I got back, I made eggs on the stove, read a book, and napped until evening. That night, something felt different. I was lying in bed, listening to the wind outside, when I thought I heard something. It was faint at first, a distant sound like sticks snapping underfoot. I held my breath and listened harder. It stopped. Then it happened again, closer this time. A slow, steady crackling of something or someone walking just beyond the window. I sat up. The cabin didn't have blinds or curtains, and I hadn't thought to cover the windows. I couldn't see out. It was too dark beyond the glass. But if someone was out there, they could see me. I turned off the light. For 10 minutes, I sat there in the dark, staring toward the window, listening. Nothing, just the wind and the ticking of the clock on the wall. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. The woods were full of animals. Still, I barely slept that night. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I walked the edge of the clearing, looking for footprints or signs that someone had been nearby. Nothing. Just leaves and fallen branches. I felt a little better. Maybe I was just on edge. Later that afternoon, I decided to walk the trail again. This time, I brought a flashlight, some water, and marked trees with small strips of torn fabric so I could find my way back more easily. The path seemed longer than before, or maybe I was just more nervous. Every sound felt sharper. Birds calling, leaves moving, branches creaking. After about 40 minutes, I noticed something strange. A small structure just off the trail to the left. It wasn't visible from the main path, you had to look for it. It looked like an old shed or maybe a hunter's blind. It was made of rotting wood, and one of the walls had collapsed inward. It didn't look used. Still, I walked around it, peering through the gaps in the wood. Inside was empty, just dirt, a few broken boards, and an old tin can, but it didn't feel right. I backed away and returned to the path, quickening my pace. I didn't want to be out there after dark. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door, even though it barely latched, and started the fire early. The warmth helped, but the feeling stuck with me, the idea that I wasn't alone. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed in bed, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again, the sound of movement outside. It was closer than the night before, right outside the wall by the kitchen. Then, nothing. Then again, 2 sharp steps crunching leaves. I stayed frozen. I didn't have a weapon, just a rusted axe outside by the firewood. I didn't dare go out. I didn't move. The steps came and went for an hour, then stopped. The next morning, I found something by the back window. A footprint, not an animal. A boot, human, deep in the dirt, as if someone had stood there for a while. My heart dropped. This wasn't my imagination. I thought about leaving, but the road back was rough, and my car had already taken a beating getting up here. I decided I'd wait one more day and leave the next morning. I kept busy, packing up what I could, double-checking the locks, and moving the axe inside. I didn't eat. I barely drank water. My stomach was in knots. That night, I stayed awake in the chair near the stove, axe across my lap. I didn't light the fire. I didn't want the glow to give me away. I waited. Just after 2 a.m., I heard it. The porch steps, wood groaning under weight, then silence. I tightened my grip on the axe. My eyes strained toward the window. A shadow moved past it. Not a deer, not a bear, person. I could feel my heartbeat in my neck. They circled the cabin. Slowly, I heard them brush against the side, heard their boots on the dirt. Then they stopped. A knock, soft, on the front door. I didn't move. I didn't answer. The knock came again, slightly louder. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then a sound from the back window. A soft tap, like fingers on glass. I stayed still until sunrise. I never slept. By morning, they were gone. No sounds, no sign of them. Just that same footprint and another one next to it. I packed the rest of my things and left immediately. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. My hands shook the entire drive. When I got home, I called my coworker and asked him about the cabin. He sounded surprised. He told me he hadn't been there in years. Said the last time he'd gone, someone had broken into the shed nearby. He never found out who. I never told him what happened. I never went back. To this day, I don't know who was out there. But I know they were watching, and I know they were waiting, and I know that if I had opened that door or moved toward that window, maybe I wouldn't have made it back at all. I booked the cabin without thinking too much about it. I needed to get away. Things at home were getting out of control. Neighbors were noisy, city traffic was constant, and my work as a freelance writer was suffering. I had fallen behind on several deadlines, and my head felt foggy all the time. I thought maybe a week away, somewhere quiet and out in nature, would help me reset and catch up. I found the cabin through a rental website. It looked small but cozy. It was deep in the woods, about a 3-hour drive from the city. There were no neighbors, no stores nearby, and barely any phone signal. The listing said it had electricity and running water, which was all I needed. I packed my laptop, some clothes, dry food, a few cans, a small cooler with frozen meat, and a box of tools just in case. I even brought a few books to read before bed. I was looking forward to the silence more than anything else. I arrived on a Monday around noon. The drive took longer than I thought because the last stretch was a narrow dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. My small hatchback scraped a few rocks on the way up. Trees towered on both sides of the road, pressing close to the path. No other cars, no signs. I had downloaded the map in advance, so I was able to follow it, but I started to feel a little uneasy as the road just kept going deeper and deeper into the woods. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked almost exactly like the pictures. Wooden, single-story, small porch out front, one chimney on the left side. The place looked worn down but stable. A single solar panel was mounted on the roof. I parked off to the side and stepped out. The silence hit me immediately. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was thick and heavy. No birds, no wind, just dead stillness. It gave me a weird feeling, but I shook it off. Maybe I just wasn't used to this kind of quiet. I unloaded my things and opened the door. The inside smelled a bit musty, like it hadn't been used in months. It was a one-room setup with a bed in the corner, a small wooden desk by the window, a gas stove and sink, and a little bathroom tucked away behind a sliding door. No internet, no phone signal, but enough power for lights and to charge my laptop. I spent the rest of that first day settling in. I opened a few windows to air the place out. I checked the water. It worked, though it was rusty for a minute. The fridge was small but ran fine once I plugged it in. I unpacked my food and supplies, then sat at the desk and opened my laptop. No distractions. I could hear myself breathe. That night, I made rice and beans on the gas stove and read a few chapters of a book before bed. I didn't fall asleep right away, though. The mattress was thin, and every time I moved, the wooden frame creaked. It was pitch black outside. I had left the curtains open, and from bed I could see straight out into the trees. No light, just darkness between the trunks, like open mouths waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up once around 3 a.m. because of a noise. It sounded like dry leaves being crunched outside. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. A few more soft steps. Then nothing. I didn't move. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling until sleep dragged me under again. The next morning, I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. I wasn't used to wildlife. I made eggs and toast, drank 2 cups of instant coffee, and sat down to write. For the first time in weeks, my mind felt clear. Words came easy. I spent the whole day typing, only stopping to eat or stretch. I felt productive. I felt like the trip was already worth it. That night, I went to bed around 11. Again, I left the curtains open. I liked being able to see outside, even if it was dark. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. No noise, just a feeling. I looked toward the window. Nothing. But the hairs on my arms were standing up. My skin felt cold. I turned on the lamp and got out of bed. I walked to the window and looked outside. Still nothing. I stood there for a while, listening. Then I locked the front door, just to be safe, and went back to bed. The next day, I saw something strange. Near the edge of the clearing, right before the trees began, I found a broken branch. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I saw what looked like boot prints in the soft dirt near it. Not clear ones, but enough of an impression to know they weren't animal tracks. They were too deep, too flat. I stared at them for a while, then looked around. Nothing else. Just trees and more trees behind those. I told myself they were old. Maybe someone had stayed here before me. Maybe the owner had been around recently. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had walked near the cabin the night before. I went back inside and worked, but I kept checking the window every hour. That night, I locked the door early. I moved the chair in front of it. I closed all the curtains. I kept the light on and lay in bed with my heart racing. I had this strong feeling that I wasn't alone out here, that someone had been watching the cabin, maybe even standing in the woods during the night, just far enough that I couldn't see them. I didn't sleep much. Every sound made me sit up. I heard a soft tapping once, like a stick against the wall, then silence again. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I found something small and strange. A torn piece of blue fabric stuck to a branch. It looked like it came from a jacket. Not mine. Not old either. The color wasn't faded. I checked my phone, hoping for signal. Still nothing. I turned on my laptop and opened a document but couldn't concentrate. I spent most of that day looking out the windows, jumping at every sound. Around dusk, I saw movement at the edge of the trees. A flash of something dark. When I focused, there was nothing. I stared for 10 minutes. I felt like my brain was making things up now. Maybe I was going stir-crazy. Maybe isolation was getting to me. I almost packed up that night, but I didn't. I didn't want to drive back in the dark, especially down that rough road. I told myself I was overreacting. I double-locked the door, pushed the dresser in front of it, and put a knife from the kitchen under my pillow. I barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside. Not steps this time, something heavier, like a body pressing against the wall. I held my breath. I didn't move. Then I heard the soft creak of the porch steps. Just 1 or 2. I stayed frozen in bed. My heart was beating so loud I thought it would give me away. No more sounds after that. I don't know how long I stayed like that, eyes wide open, every muscle tight. I think I passed out from exhaustion eventually. In the morning, I opened the door slowly. The ground in front of the steps had fresh footprints. Clear this time. Shoes. Big ones. Definitely not mine. They led from the trees to the porch, then back into the woods. I stood there for a long time. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have cell signal. I didn't have a weapon, just a kitchen knife. I didn't know if whoever it was would come back. I packed my things in silence. I threw everything into the car without organizing it. I was ready to leave, even if the sun wasn't all the way up yet. But when I turned the key, the car didn't start. I tried again. Just a click. Battery. I popped the hood. The battery was gone. Completely gone. Not disconnected, gone. Someone had removed it during the night. That was the first time I really panicked. I sat down on the ground and stared at the car. I felt like I was in a trap. Someone had followed me here. Someone had waited until I was asleep, then disabled my only way out. I thought about walking back to the main road, but it was miles through thick forest. I didn't even know if I'd find help out there. What if they were still watching? I went back inside and locked everything. I blocked the door again. I filled a pot with water and checked my food. I had enough to last maybe 4 or 5 days. I stayed inside the whole day, eyes on the window, knife in my hand. I didn't write. I didn't move unless I had to. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, I saw someone. They stood just beyond the tree line. A man, I think, wearing dark clothes, just standing, not moving. I turned off the light and crouched under the window. When I looked back again, he was gone. The next morning, I made a decision. I took my bag, packed water, food, and the knife. I left everything else behind. I followed the dirt road on foot, heading back the way I came. I didn't care how far it was. I just needed to get away. Took almost half the day. I heard things in the woods behind me, branches snapping, footsteps, but I never turned around. I kept walking. Eventually, I reached the paved road. I flagged down a truck. The driver took me to the nearest town. I went to the police. They sent someone to check the cabin, but by the time they got there, it was empty. No tracks, no signs of anyone, just my stuff still inside. The battery was found a few feet away in the woods. They said it looked like a prank or a theft. Nothing serious. No cameras, no proof. I never went back. I didn't finish the work I planned to do. I didn't even collect my things. I wasn't new to hunting. I grew up around it. My father used to take me out every fall, ever since I was 11. I'd learned to sit still for hours, to read animal signs, and to respect the forest. Over the years, life had gotten busy, but I made a promise to myself to go hunting at least once a year. Last year, I missed it. This year, I was determined not to. That's why I booked a week off in late October and rented a cabin deep in the forest of northern Wisconsin. I didn't want to go to one of the regular public lands. Too many people, too many rules. I wanted quiet, solitude, a week away from everything and everyone. Just me, my rifle, and the woods. I found the cabin through a website that listed private land for short-term rental. The price was low, and the description was simple. Rustic hunting cabin, solar lights, gas stove, no running water, 120 acres of private land. Thick woods, great for deer. There were a few blurry photos showing a wooden structure with a metal roof and a small deck. I didn't care much about comfort. I just wanted space and freedom. I booked it for 6 nights, Monday through Sunday. I drove up early on a Monday morning. The sky was clear, and the trees were already losing most of their leaves. The farther north I went, the colder it got. By the time I pulled off the paved road and onto the gravel trail that led to the cabin, the temperature had dropped to just above freezing. The forest around me was thick, the trees packed tight, and the underbrush wet from a recent rain. The gravel road narrowed after a mile and became more of a path. I drove slow, careful not to bottom out my truck. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked even smaller than in the photos. One room, from what I could tell. It sat on short stilts, and the deck had a wooden bench. A propane tank stood to the left, a rusted metal chimney rose out the roof, and a large pile of split firewood sat under a plastic tarp near the door. The key was exactly where the owner said it would be, under a flat stone near the steps. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The place smelled like pine, smoke, and mildew. There was a cot, a wood stove, a small table, 2 folding chairs, and shelves lined with canned goods, matches, and lantern fuel. A window on each wall let in the gray daylight, though not much. There was no cell signal. I expected that. I unpacked my gear. Sleeping bag, food, water jugs, rifle, ammo, flashlight, batteries, knife, binoculars, and my hunting clothes. I had brought plenty of layers. I also brought a small cooler with fresh food that I'd use up in the first 2 days, then switch to cans. I set up everything neatly. I liked order. It helped me feel in control. By the time I finished organizing, it was already afternoon. I didn't go out hunting that day. I just walked the property line and marked a few spots I liked. There was a small stream about 10 minutes west of the cabin. some thick pines farther up the hill, and what looked like an old, overgrown trail to the east. It was quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. No people, no planes overhead, just wind and birds. That night, I sat on the deck with a blanket wrapped around me and watched the sky. It was cloudy, but the moon still lit up the forest in silver and gray. I kept my rifle close out of habit more than fear. I heard coyotes in the distance. One howl, then another, then silence. I slept in my sleeping bag on the cot with the fire going low in the stove. The next day, I woke up before sunrise, dressed in layers, and went out to hunt. I carried my rifle, a small backpack with water and snacks, and my compass. I moved slowly, making as little noise as possible. The woods were still. Cold air made my breath fog out. I saw a couple deer tracks near the stream and followed them. Around mid-morning, I spotted a young buck but didn't shoot. Too small. I watched him for a few minutes through my scope, then let him walk away. By noon, I was back at the cabin, heating up some canned stew on the gas stove. I felt good, calm, like I was finally where I belonged. That second night, I built a bigger fire. I heard something moving in the trees around midnight, but it was probably raccoons or a deer. Still, I stayed up a while longer, just listening. Then I went to bed. On the third day, things started to feel a little off. I went farther north that morning, into the thicker woods beyond the hill. I found a tree stand someone had built long ago, rotting and half collapsed. Below it, I saw a clearing, a good spot. I sat there for a while, waiting, watching, but something about the forest felt off. I don't know how else to describe it. The air was still, but not calm, like the whole place was holding its breath. I didn't see any deer that morning. No birds either. Even the squirrels were quiet. Around 10 a.m., I heard a branch snap behind me. I turned quick, thinking maybe it was a deer circling, but there was nothing. I scanned the trees for 10 minutes. Still nothing. I chalked it up to nerves. I hadn't seen another human being since I arrived. Sometimes your mind starts playing games when you're alone for too long. That night, while sitting on the deck, I thought I saw a flashlight flicker in the woods. Just once. A quick beam of light. I stood up and watched. Nothing. I thought maybe it was lightning, but there were no clouds. I didn't go into the woods to check. Just went inside, locked the door, and made sure the fire was strong. I kept the rifle next to my cot that night. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I found boot prints near the stream. They weren't mine. Mine had a thick tread. These were lighter, thinner, and smaller. The prints came from the east, followed the stream for about 30 feet, then vanished into the brush. They looked fresh. I followed them a little ways but lost them in the wet leaves. I felt uneasy. I was supposed to be alone out here. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The bench on the deck had been moved, just slightly, a few inches to the left. I hadn't touched it since I arrived. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to convince myself it had always been like that. But it hadn't. I knew it hadn't. I spent the rest of that day inside the cabin. I didn't go hunting. I checked my truck twice. Still locked. Nothing missing. I cleaned my rifle again, not because it needed it, but because I needed something to do with my hands. The silence outside felt different now. Less peaceful. More like something waiting. That night, I didn't build a fire. I didn't want the light to make me a target. I stayed inside with a blanket, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the deck. Slow, steady, deliberate. I froze. My heart was pounding. The steps stopped right in front of the door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. After maybe 30 seconds, the steps moved again, slowly away, then down the steps, then nothing. I waited an hour before I dared to peek through the window. I saw nothing but dark woods. No one. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I opened the door. The bench was moved again. This time it was turned, facing the forest instead of the door. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, the same ones from near the stream. Lighter tread, smaller size. That was the 5th day. I packed up. I didn't care that I had 2 days left. I was done. I didn't want to wait around and find out who was messing with me or why. I loaded my gear, locked the cabin, and started driving down the gravel path. 2 miles in, I found a tree blocking the road. A fresh fall, still green on the inside. No wind the night before, no storm. Someone had cut it and dropped it across the road. I got out, checked the base, saw fresh axe marks, clean, sharp cuts. Someone had done this on purpose. Recently, I turned around, went back to the cabin, and grabbed my axe. It took me 2 hours to chop enough of the trunk to clear a space wide enough to drive through. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every crack of the axe felt too loud, too exposed. I finally got the truck through, drove fast down the path, and didn't stop until I hit pavement. I didn't report anything. What would I even say? That someone watched me in the woods and moved my bench? That they walked on my porch at night and blocked my road out? There were no signs of theft, no violence, nothing that would make the police care. But I knew someone had been watching me from the moment I got there. They stayed just far enough away, close enough to let me know I wasn't alone. When I got home, I looked up the property listing again. It was gone. Not rented, not unavailable, gone. No trace of it. I called the number I had saved for the owner. Disconnected. No voicemail. A week later, I found a manila envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a photo taken from behind a tree. It showed me sitting on the deck that second night, wrapped in a blanket, looking up at the sky. Whoever was out there had been close, closer than I ever realized. I never went back to the woods after that, and I never hunted alone again. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've worked in construction for over a decade, dealt with all sorts of people, traveled alone, and done solo hunting trips since I was in my early 20s. I've slept through thunderstorms in thin tents, hiked through bare country with nothing but a flare gun, and even once got lost in a swamp overnight. But nothing I've experienced ever made my skin crawl like what happened last fall when I stayed in a remote cabin up in the Sawatch Range of Colorado. I was burnt out from work and everything else in my life, so I planned a week away from it all. I didn't want Wi-Fi, I didn't want neighbors, I didn't even want a paved road. Just quiet. I found an old hunting cabin listed by a guy who lived 2 towns over. It didn't have running water or electricity, just a wood stove, a cot, and an outhouse. He said it was about 8 miles from the nearest road, but if I had a truck with decent clearance, I could get most of the way up. I rented it without thinking twice. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, just said I'd be off the grid for a week. The drive up was rough. The road turned into a boulder-strewn path halfway through the forest, and after an hour of crawling up switchbacks, my truck could go no further. I hiked the last mile with my backpack and a 5-gallon water container. The cabin looked like something out of the 1950s. Gray logs weathered by time, a rusty tin roof, and a small porch with a single rocking chair. There were no other structures in sight. No power lines, no trails, just thick trees and mountains. Inside was dusty but solid. A small cot with a wool blanket, a table with a lantern and some ratty paperbacks, a wood stove in the corner. I unpacked, set up my gear, chopped some wood, and got a fire going. That first night, the silence was thick. I didn't hear a single plane, no cars, not even wind, just the occasional creak of the cabin cooling down. On the second day, I woke up to light snowfall. I walked a couple miles into the woods with my rifle, hoping to spot some mule deer or at least sea tracks. I didn't see anything but birds and squirrels. Still, it felt good to be away from everything. I stayed out until the sun began to drop behind the mountains. On the way back, I noticed something odd, 2 deep grooves in the trail I'd made earlier with my boots. They weren't boot prints. They were longer, deeper, almost like something heavy had been dragged. I tried to convince myself it was a fallen branch or maybe an animal clawing at the ground, but it didn't sit right with me. Still, I went inside, made dinner, and kept the fire going. That night, I heard something moving around outside. Not footsteps, just soft crunches in the snow, then silence. I sat in the dark with the fire going low, just listening. My rifle was by the door, and I kept it loaded. The third day, I didn't go far. I stuck close to the cabin, chopped more wood, and double-checked all the windows and the lock on the door. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt watched, like the woods were full of eyes I couldn't see. I kept glancing at the tree line, waiting for movement. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like heavy breathing outside the window near the cot. No footsteps, just this slow, raspy breathing. I didn't move. I didn't light the lantern. I just laid there with my hand on the rifle and waited for it to stop. It went on for what felt like an hour before it just faded. By the fourth day, I was done pretending I was relaxed. I packed everything into my backpack and decided I'd hike down to the truck and leave a day early. But when I stepped outside, I found something that stopped me cold. On the porch railing, someone or something had placed a small pile of pine cones, all perfectly balanced. 6 of them, stacked one on top of the other. I hadn't done that, and they weren't there the night before. They looked fresh, like they'd just been placed. I scanned the trees, my heart hammering. I didn't see anyone. I grabbed my bag and water, but I couldn't bring myself to turn my back to the woods. I walked backward for a while, rifle out, until the trail turned and I had no choice but to face forward. The hike down was nerve-wracking. I kept hearing movement behind me, like something pacing me from the trees. When I got to my truck, the passenger door was wide open. I always lock it, always. The glove box was open. My emergency kit was dumped on the seat, but nothing was missing. I checked all around the truck but didn't see anyone. No tire tracks, just mine. I drove as fast as the road allowed, bouncing hard over rocks and scraping past brush. It wasn't until I got back to the highway that I felt like I could breathe again. I drove straight home and didn't unpack for a week. I didn't tell anyone for a long time, not because I thought they'd laugh, but because I couldn't explain it. There was no proof, no clear threat, just strange details that didn't add up. The breathing, the pine cones, the dragging marks. It all felt too personal, like whatever was up there knew I was alone. Months passed. Then, one afternoon while I was cleaning out the truck bed, I found something wedged in the corner under the spare tire. Pine cone, dry, brittle, and broken at the tip. I hadn't seen it before. I hadn't put it there. I stared at it for a long time, heart pounding again, wondering how it got there and what it meant. Since then, I haven't gone back to the woods alone. I still hunt, still hike, but always with someone else. And I never, ever go off the grid anymore. Not because I'm scared of what might be out there, but because I think whatever it was might not be finished with me yet. And I don't want to give it another chance. That week in the cabin changed how I see the wild. Not as something untamed, but as something ancient. Something that watches back when you look into it. Something that doesn't need to show its face to make itself known. Something that leaves signs. You just have to know how to see them. It was the 3rd week of October when I took time off from work to stay in a remote cabin up in northern Idaho. I had been drowning in city noise, traffic, meetings, emails. I needed to hit pause. So, I found a small off-grid cabin online, deep in the forest near Priest Lake. The listing said it had no electricity, no running water, no neighbors for miles, and could only be accessed by a long, steep dirt road. That was exactly what I wanted. Something isolated and completely quiet. The drive there was long. Once I left the main highway, the paved road turned into gravel, then into compacted dirt. The deeper I drove into the forest, the narrower the road got, until tree branches scraped against both sides of my car. It was early evening when I finally pulled up in front of the cabin. The last stretch of road was so steep that I had to park about 50 yards downhill and carry my stuff up. The cabin looked like something out of a survivalist's dream. It had thick logs for walls, a sharply angled tin roof, and a small porch that looked out over the dense trees. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. There was no phone signal, no sound of passing cars, not even the distant hum of power lines. Just wind rustling through trees and the occasional bird call. Inside, the cabin was small but solid. One room with a wood stove in the corner, a small cot along the wall, and a table with 2 chairs. A few shelves held some old supplies. Matches, candles, some canned food that looked like it had been there for years. I had brought enough food, water, and firewood to last a week. That first night was quiet. I sat on the porch after dark with a blanket wrapped around me and a flashlight nearby. The stars looked different out there, sharper, brighter, but the forest was a black wall beyond the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see anything past the first line of trees. I kept feeling like something was watching me from out there, but I told myself it was just the silence playing tricks. By the third night, things started to feel off. I had been settling into a routine: wake up, make coffee on the little camp stove, chop some firewood, hike a little around the cabin, eat, read, sleep. That night, around 1 a.m, I woke up to the sound of dry leaves crunching outside. It wasn't windy, and the sound wasn't steady like wind or an animal rooting around. It was slow, steady, like careful footsteps. I held my breath and listened. The steps circled the cabin once, slowly, then stopped. I sat up, heart pounding, staring at the wooden door. I hadn't brought any weapons, just a pocket knife and a hatchet for wood. I grabbed the hatchet and waited. Nothing happened. I sat there for an hour, ears straining, before finally drifting off again. In the morning, I found footprints in the soft dirt just beyond the porch. They weren't from an animal. They were boot prints, normal-sized. Someone had walked around the cabin during the night. I checked the door and windows, no sign of forced entry. But that didn't help. I walked the area around the cabin, thinking maybe it was just a lost hiker. But there was no sign of anyone else. That night, I stacked firewood against the door and tied a string to the inside handle that led to a tin cup on the floor. If anyone opened it, the cup would rattle. I barely slept. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. A few times, I thought I heard something moving through the trees, but it never came close. Day 5 was worse. I found a dead bird on the porch. A crow, its neck broken. It hadn't just died, it had been placed there. I could see the small smear of blood on the wood. I looked around the clearing, heart hammering, but saw nothing. I didn't want to admit I was scared, but I started packing a bag that afternoon. I planned to leave the next morning. That night, I stayed awake in the dark, holding the hatchet. Around 3 a.m, the sound came again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. I heard something tapping on the back wall of the cabin. Not knocking, just slow, rhythmic tapping. I didn't have a window on that side, so I couldn't see anything. I didn't move, just sat there, frozen. The tapping stopped after a few minutes. An hour later, the cup on the floor rattled. Someone had tried the door. I got up slowly and pressed my ear to the door. I heard breathing, very faint. Someone was standing just on the other side. I didn't say a word, didn't move. The breathing stopped. Then silence. After a while, I opened the door just a crack and peeked out. No one. But in the dirt, there were fresh footprints. Same size, same boots. I didn't sleep at all. As soon as the sun came up, I threw everything into my backpack, took the keys, and headed down the trail to my car. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced someone was watching me. I reached the spot where I had parked and stopped dead. My car had been tampered with. The driver's side door was open, and the wires beneath the steering column had been pulled out. Someone had tried to hotwire it or disable it. The battery was also missing. I stood there in shock. I had no signal, no satellite phone, nothing. It was over 10 miles to the nearest paved road. I couldn't go back to the cabin. I didn't feel safe there anymore. I took the backpack and started walking down the dirt road, heading south, sticking to the middle where I could see both sides. Every sound made me jump. I saw movement in the trees a few times but couldn't tell what it was. I walked all day, stopping only to drink water or catch my breath. Just before sunset, I reached a small service road and saw tire tracks. I followed them and finally reached a ranger station around nightfall. It was closed, but there was a working emergency phone outside. I called for help and told them everything. A sheriff's deputy arrived in about an hour. I explained what had happened. They drove me back to the car, and sure enough, the battery was gone, and there were clear signs of tampering. They found more footprints, too, but whoever had been there was long gone. The cabin was searched, and nothing was stolen. No real damage, but the bird on the porch, the footsteps, the attempted break-in, they were all real. The sheriff told me they'd keep the case open, but they didn't have enough to go on. No one else was supposed to be out there. No other cabins. No missing persons. I never found out who was watching me, or why. I sold the rest of my reservation to someone else and left Idaho that same week. Since then, I've stuck to places with neighbors nearby and always bring a satellite phone. I still wake up sometimes, thinking I hear footsteps outside the window. That week in the cabin changed me. It showed me how fast things can go wrong when you're alone. Not because of nature, but because of other people. People you don't see. People who don't want to be seen. I needed a break from people. That's the truth. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. I couldn't remember the last night I slept without waking up to some notification, and the walls of my apartment started to feel too tight. I was working 2 jobs just to stay above water, and I was so burnt out I couldn't even enjoy the weekends anymore. One night, after staying up way too late watching a video about people who live off-grid, I made a decision. I would rent a cabin, somewhere far, just for a few days, alone. It didn't take long to find something. I looked for somewhere cheap, isolated, but with basic amenities. No point roughing it too much. I found a small listing on an old forum that had barely any pictures, but the description said, private mountain cabin, quiet, no neighbors, good for writing, hiking, and solitude. That was enough for me. I emailed the owner, wired the money through a sketchy online platform, and got a single email back with an address, a lockbox code, and a note saying GPS won't work. Follow the directions exactly. That should have been my first red flag, but I was too excited to care. I packed light, just clothes, canned food, a water jug, a flashlight, power bank, a couple of books, and a knife I bought on impulse years ago but never used. I filled my car with gas and hit the road. The cabin was supposed to be in a place called Silver Creek, somewhere in the mountains about 5 hours north. I'd never heard of it. It wasn't on Google Maps, but I figured small towns don't always show up online. The first few hours were easy. Wide highways, then narrowing roads, then just 2-lane back roads cutting through endless forest. The directions were typed in plain text. Turn left after mile marker 27. Drive 2 miles until the gravel begins. Keep right at the fork. Drive 3 more miles. Cabin is on the left behind the pine fence. The turnoff wasn't marked. I only found it because I slowed down at mile marker 27 and saw an old wooden post that had probably once held a sign. The road was narrow, and the trees closed in quickly. It was mid-afternoon, but the sun already looked low through the trees. Felt like evening. I kept following the path. It wasn't really a road, more like a fire trail. I went over potholes, dipped through muddy sections, and had to crawl through parts where the ground felt too soft under the tires. Eventually, I saw it. The fence was barely standing, just crooked wooden posts with gaps between them. Behind it sat the cabin. It looked old, but not ruined, just worn. It had a slanted metal roof, moss growing up one side, and a small porch that sagged in the middle. The lockbox was hanging by a single screw, and when I opened it, the key inside was rusty, but it still turned in the door. Inside smelled like wood and dust. It was one room with a small bed in the corner, a table near the front window, a wood stove in the middle, and a bathroom with no door, just a curtain. There was no fridge, just a cooler with melted ice. A few drawers held some chipped plates and dull utensils. A yellowed note was taped to the wall. If you use the generator, refill it. Gas can in shed. I unpacked and sat on the porch for a while, listening to the forest. It was dead silent except for the wind and the occasional crack of branches. No birds, no bugs, just stillness. Felt like the world had shut off out here. That first night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. I made a can of soup on a small camping stove, read a book by flashlight, and lay in bed with the window cracked open. I heard the wind moving through the trees like waves. I fell asleep fast. I woke up to the sound of crunching. It was pitch dark. No moon, no stars. Just black. I had left the flashlight by the bed and turned it on quickly. The beam cut through the dark but showed nothing inside. I sat up and listened. At first, I thought it was an animal. Then I realized the crunching wasn't random. It was slow, like footsteps, moving around the cabin. I held my breath. The sound stopped at the back wall. I waited. Nothing. Then more crunching, slower this time, heading toward the front. I stepped as quietly as I could to the door and pressed my ear to it. I couldn't hear anything now. I stayed like that for what felt like forever. Eventually, I went back to bed but didn't sleep. I waited until the sky outside started to turn gray. Then I got up and checked around the cabin. No tracks, just wind-blown leaves. I told myself it was deer, maybe a bear. The wind can make trees sound like movement. I knew that. I've read it before, but something didn't sit right. I felt watched, like something knew I was there. That second day, I tried to enjoy myself. I walked a little way down the trail behind the cabin, not far, just enough to stretch my legs. But the forest felt different, too quiet. The air was heavy. Every branch I stepped on felt loud. I kept glancing behind me. By late afternoon, I was back at the cabin. I locked the door and pulled the curtain across the one window. That night, I didn't open the window. I kept the flashlight close. I fell asleep with the blanket pulled over my face like a kid. I woke up again. This time it was scratching, light like fingertips against wood. It was coming from the window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The scratching stopped. Then I heard it again, this time on the wall behind my head. I sat up slowly and turned on the flashlight. The beam swung across the room. Nothing. No shadows, no movement. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been outside. I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I checked the outside walls. There were marks. Long vertical streaks like someone had run a branch or fingers down the wood. Not deep, but fresh. That day, I wanted to leave. I packed my stuff, loaded it back into the car, and drove back toward the fork in the road. But something was wrong. The road was gone. I swear it was there 2 days ago. But now, instead of a fork, it was just forest. No tire tracks, no split in the road. Just trees. I got out and walked a bit, pushing through undergrowth. Nothing. No signs anyone had ever been there. I walked back to the car, heart racing. I knew the road forked. I remembered it clearly, but now it didn't. I drove back to the cabin, shaken. I didn't unpack. I sat in the car for hours trying to get a signal. Nothing. No bars, no reception. I turned the car off to save gas. That night, I didn't go inside the cabin. I slept in the car with the doors locked. I woke up again, heart pounding. This time it was tapping. Slow, deliberate taps against the passenger side window. I couldn't see anything through the fogged-up glass. I stayed still. The tapping stopped. Then I heard something brush against the back of the car. Like fingers. I turned on the headlights. Nothing. But I couldn't sleep after that. I stayed up until morning. That day, I tried to find the road again. I walked for hours. I marked trees with a knife so I could find my way back. After an hour, I realized the trail I thought I was following was curving in a circle. I kept ending up near the cabin. By the 4th day, my food was almost gone. I was tired, paranoid, and starting to feel sick. I tried to ration water. I found the generator in the shed but didn't want to make noise by starting it. I felt like if I made too much sound, something would come closer. That night, I stayed inside with the knife next to me. I didn't even use the flashlight. I just sat in the dark, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time slower, heavier. They moved to the porch. Then I heard the floorboards creak. Then something knocked. 3 knocks. Slow. Then silence. I stayed frozen until morning. The next day, I decided I was done. If I had to crash the car through the woods, so be it. I started it up and drove straight ahead, ignoring the road, pushing through underbrush. I didn't care if I ruined the car. Somehow, after about half a mile, I hit pavement, an actual road. I don't know how. It wasn't where the map said it would be, but I took it and didn't stop driving until I saw a gas station. I pulled in, shaking. The attendant looked at me like I'd been in a car accident. I never went back. I never told anyone the full story. I looked up Silver Creek again, but nothing came up. The emails from the cabin owner? Gone. The listing? Gone. It's like it was never real. But I know it was, and I still don't know what was outside that cabin every night. I just know it knew I was there, and it didn't want me to leave, but I did, and I'm never going back. I was burned out. Work had become a cycle of waking up, staring at a screen for 10 hours, answering emails that didn't matter, and going to bed too late. My body was tired, my mind was foggy, and everything felt meaningless. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to hear anything from anyone either. I just wanted quiet. So I booked a remote cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was a small, one-room place tucked far off a county road, about 20 minutes down a dirt trail that didn't even show up on GPS. I found it through a small rental site that specialized in off-grid places. The listing said it had no electricity, no Wi-Fi, no plumbing, just a wood stove, a small bed, and a pump for well water outside. That was exactly what I wanted. I brought only the basics: a sleeping bag, canned food, a flashlight, a map, a hunting knife, a backpack with some tools, and a thick book I hadn't read in years. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not because I was trying to be mysterious, but because I genuinely didn't think anyone would care. I left my phone in the glove box of my car, which I parked just off the main road. From there, I walked in. The hike to the cabin took about 30 minutes. It had rained recently, so the dirt path was soft and a little slippery. I was sweating by the time I saw the small A-frame cabin peeking through the trees. It looked exactly like the pictures: old wood, a metal roof rusted in places, and a small porch facing the forest. The silence was immediate and thick. No traffic, no hum of electricity, not even birds for the first few minutes. Just trees swaying gently in the wind and the sound of my own boots hitting the soft ground. It was perfect. Inside the cabin, it smelled like wood smoke and earth. The stove was in the corner, and the bed was just a mattress on a wooden frame. There was a small table with a few chairs, and an old metal lantern hanging on a hook near the door. A stack of firewood sat in the corner, dry and ready. I dropped my gear and sat down on the bed. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked my things, cleaned out a few spider webs, and walked the area around the cabin. I marked a few trees with red tape from my pack so I wouldn't get lost if I wandered far. I made a small fire in the stove that night, warmed up some soup from a can, and went to bed early. The second day, I started to notice little things. At first, it was just a feeling like being watched. I brushed it off. I was alone in unfamiliar woods. That feeling was natural, I told myself. Most people don't realize how much noise the modern world makes until it's gone. In total silence, your brain starts inventing things to fill the gaps. But then, I noticed something that didn't make sense. On the third morning, I stepped outside to pump some water and saw fresh footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They came from the trees, stopped just a few feet from the cabin door, then turned around and went back the way they came. No boot prints, just bare feet. The toes were clear, the arches deep. They looked fresh, not washed out by rain or wind. I stood there for a while, just staring at them. The air felt colder than it had before. My first thought was animal tracks, but they were definitely human. My second thought was that maybe someone had followed me. But why walk barefoot in the woods? And why come so close to the cabin and not knock or make a sound? I checked my gear. Everything was still there. The cabin was untouched. The door had been locked from the inside, just as I'd left it before bed. I told myself it was probably some weird local, maybe a drifter, maybe just a kid messing around. I stayed inside that day, reading, keeping the knife close by, and trying not to look out the windows too much. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the wood and gust of wind made me sit up. I kept the lantern on low, just enough to see the edges of the room. I didn't hear anything specific, just that thick silence again, like something was waiting. The fourth day, I found more prints. This time, they circled the cabin. Same bare feet, still fresh. This time, they went around the entire building. They even led up to the back window where they stopped for a while. The ground was disturbed like someone had stood there a long time, staring in. I felt sick. My hands were shaking. I had no phone, no way to call for help. I considered leaving, but the walk back to the car was long. If someone was messing with me, they might be watching from the woods. I didn't want to risk running into them on the trail. I stayed again. I barricaded the door with the table and some chairs. I kept the knife on me, even while I slept. I barely slept. The 5th day, something new happened. I was boiling water over the stove when I heard it. A sound just outside the cabin. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like breathing. Slow, heavy breathing just beyond the wall. I froze. It lasted maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. I didn't move for an hour after that. I didn't go outside that day. I rationed what food I had and sat by the door, knife in hand. Every few hours, I would hear branches snapping far off in the woods, sometimes closer. Never close enough to be sure of what it was, but close enough to know it wasn't wind. That night, I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the cabin wall. A light scraping sound, like fingers dragging along the wood. It circled the cabin slowly. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. I sat there holding the knife so tightly my hand started to cramp. Eventually, the sound stopped. I stayed awake until the sun came up. The 6th morning, I knew I had to leave. Whatever game was being played, it was escalating. I didn't care who it was anymore. I just knew I needed to get out. I packed everything in a hurry, not even eating. I threw the knife in my pocket and slung my bag over my shoulder. I didn't bother with the water pump. As I stepped outside, I saw something on the porch, a small pile of rocks stacked in a neat triangle. It hadn't been there the day before. I didn't touch it. I didn't stop. I ran. I ran for the trail, not stopping to catch my breath, not looking back. My boots slipped in the mud a few times and I nearly fell, but I didn't stop moving. The woods felt too quiet again, like they were holding their breath. Took me 40 minutes to reach the car. When I got there, I found the glove box open. My phone was gone. The back seat was empty too. My emergency blanket, my second flashlight, both gone. I had locked the car. I was sure of it, but there was no sign of a break-in, no broken windows, no scratches, just unlocked doors and missing gear. I drove straight home. I didn't stop once. I kept checking the rearview mirror the whole way. Once I got home, I changed all the locks on my apartment. I bought a security camera. I didn't go outside unless I had to. I didn't sleep well for weeks. I called the rental site and told them to take the cabin off their listings. They didn't ask why. Maybe I wasn't the first person to say something. It's been over a year now, and I still think about that place. I still wonder who was out there, or what they wanted. I don't believe in monsters, and I don't think it was some supernatural thing. I think it was a person, a very real, very dangerous person who knew those woods better than I ever could. And I think if I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't have made it out. That place was meant to be quiet, but someone else wanted it quiet too, and they didn't want me there. I haven't gone camping since, and I never will again. It was late September when I drove out to the cabin. I had rented it for 2 weeks just to get away from everything. I'd been burned out from work and needed a break from screens, traffic, and people. The cabin was deep in the woods of northern Idaho, about 40 minutes away from the nearest gas station and maybe an hour from a small town with a grocery store. It wasn't a luxury place. It was old, made of dark wood, and looked like it hadn't been updated in at least 20 years. But it was clean, had running water, a wood stove, and enough space to stretch out and breathe. There was no cell signal, no Wi-Fi, and no landline. That was part of the reason I picked it. The first few days were peaceful. I chopped firewood, cooked simple meals, read books I'd been meaning to get to for years, and hiked around the property. The cabin was surrounded by forest on all sides, and there was a narrow trail that ran down to a shallow creek maybe a 10-minute walk away. I felt safe, disconnected, and quiet for the first time in a long while. But by the 4th night, something changed. It started with a sound. I had just finished eating dinner, washed my plate, and was sitting by the fire with a book in my lap. The sun had gone down, and the woods were already pitch black outside. I heard a loud, sharp crack echo through the trees. At first, I thought it was just a branch falling. Trees shed limbs all the time, especially as the weather starts to shift into fall. I waited for more sounds but didn't hear anything else. The next morning, I found something strange. I went down the trail toward the creek for my usual walk and saw footprints in the mud near the bank. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked that far the day before, and the footprints were fresh. They were from boots. Deep treads, wide pattern, maybe a size or two bigger than mine. Whoever made them had walked around near the water and then disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a while, listening. I didn't hear anything out of place, just the soft rush of the creek and the wind moving through the trees. But the thought of someone else being out there, walking around near my cabin without saying anything, left a bad feeling in my stomach. I told myself it was probably a hunter. The area wasn't fenced or anything, and even though I was renting the cabin, the woods weren't private property. Still, something about the silence felt wrong. I went back to the cabin and locked the door, even though it was the middle of the day. The next few days, I tried to keep things normal. I kept chopping wood, hiking, and reading, but I noticed I was more jumpy than before. I would hear twigs snapping or something rustling and freeze up, holding my breath. On the 6th night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside, slow, steady steps moving across the porch, then pausing. But every time I got up and looked out the window, I saw nothing, just the shadows from the trees moving with the wind. Around 2 a.m., I heard a soft tap on the side of the cabin. It wasn't loud. It was so light I almost thought I imagined it. Then it happened again, a little stronger. I sat up in bed, heart racing. I waited, holding completely still. Then nothing. No more tapping. No more sounds. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I walked around the cabin and looked for signs. There were no marks on the wood, no footprints on the porch. But I noticed something small and strange near the corner of the cabin. A cigarette butt. I don't smoke. No one had visited me. I knew it wasn't mine. It hadn't rained in days, so it looked recent, just slightly crushed, still fresh. That's when I started to feel like I was being watched. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the axe nearby and left the front door unlocked in case I had to run out. I didn't go hiking. I didn't want to get too far from the cabin. I kept glancing toward the tree line, expecting to see someone step out, but nothing ever happened. I tried to sleep again that night, but I couldn't. Around midnight, I heard something hit the wall. Not a tap this time, but a thud like a rock or a fist. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the axe, and stood by the window. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want whoever it was to know where I was inside. I stood there for what felt like hours. I didn't see anything, but I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I made a decision. I packed my bag and loaded it in the car. I wasn't going to wait around for something worse to happen. I was done. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The engine didn't even try to turn over, just a dull click. I tried again. Same sound. I opened the hood, looked around, but I didn't know much about engines. The battery wasn't loose, and the lights worked, so it wasn't that. I had no idea what was wrong, and there was no way to call for help. I stood there staring at the trees. I didn't know what to do. It was a full day's walk to the town if I followed the road. I didn't like the idea of leaving the cabin, but I also didn't want to spend another night there. I spent that whole day inside, windows locked, axe in hand. I only went outside to use the bathroom and get more water. That night, I heard footsteps again. They were slow, almost dragging. I could hear them on the porch, pacing from one side to the other. Then silence. Then a loud knock. Just one knock. Not on the door, but on the wall by the back window. I stayed frozen. I didn't move. I was too scared to even look out the window this time. I sat on the floor, clutching the axe with both hands, and stayed like that until the sky started turning gray. When it got light, I opened the door and walked around the cabin. There were footprints in the dirt, boot prints, the same kind I'd seen at the creek. They went up to the back window and circled the cabin. Then they disappeared into the woods again. I didn't wait any longer. I filled my backpack with food, a knife, my water bottle, and a flashlight, and I started walking. I followed the road back toward town. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't take breaks. I walked all day until my legs felt like they were going to fall off. Around sunset, I saw a parked car on the side of the road near a gate and nearly cried from relief. A man in a work vest was closing the gate to some logging road. I waved him down. He drove me the rest of the way into town. I told him my car broke down. I didn't tell him anything else. I came back later with a tow truck and got the car. The mechanic in town said someone had pulled out a few wires under the hood. He showed me the damage. It had been done on purpose. I never figured out who was out there. I never saw them. They didn't leave notes or break in or say anything. But they wanted me scared, and it worked. I never went back to that cabin. I've never rented a place that remote again. Now, even when I go camping, I keep my car close, and I never stay longer than a night or two. And I always make sure someone knows exactly where I'm going. Because someone out there, maybe still in those woods, likes knowing when people are alone. It was supposed to be a break from everything. That's what I told myself when I booked the place. No phones, no work, no people, just a quiet log cabin deep in the mountains. It was early January, right after New Year's, and I was burnt out from the nonstop pressure at work. I figured a few days off the grid would help clear my head. The cabin was in Colorado, way off the main road. I'd found it on a small vacation rental site. It looked rustic, kind of old, but still cozy in the photos. The listing warned that four-wheel drive was strongly recommended in the winter, but I had just gotten my Jeep serviced, and I was confident it could handle some snow. The plan was simple. Drive in, bring enough food for 5 days, stay inside, hike a little during the day, and read or journal at night. Just me, the trees, and silence. I packed everything carefully. Dried food, canned stuff, extra water, batteries, firewood bundles, my sleeping bag, even a small hatchet just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble, but something about being in the wilderness alone makes you prepare a little differently. My friends thought I was crazy to go off alone, especially in winter, but I like solitude. The drive up started smooth. The roads were mostly clear the first 2 hours. Then the elevation started climbing, and the snow on the shoulder thickened. By the last hour, I was driving slow, creeping through forest roads that hadn't been plowed in a few days. Snow flurries had started, light at first. I remember thinking it made the woods look peaceful, quiet. Everything had that still, muffled feeling that happens when snow falls. When I reached the cabin, I was relieved. It looked exactly like the photos: log walls, small porch, and a metal chimney poking out from the roof. There were snow-covered pines all around, and not a single other building in sight. I parked beside it, left the engine running while I unlocked the door, and hauled my stuff inside. It was cold, but not unbearable. I lit a fire in the cast iron stove using the kindling left in a basket. Caught quickly. Soon the cabin warmed up. I set my bags down and walked through the small space. There was one main room with the stove, a couch, and a kitchen area. A small hallway led to a single bedroom and a bathroom with an old pump toilet. No electricity, just a few oil lamps and a battery-powered lantern. That first evening went by quietly. I made instant noodles, drank some tea, read for a bit, and fell asleep early. I woke up once in the night because of the wind. It howled through the trees like it was angry, but I was too tired to care. The next morning, snow was still falling. Not hard, just steady. I went out to check on my Jeep, brushing it off and moving it a bit to make sure it wouldn't get frozen in place. That's when I noticed the first weird thing. Tracks. Boot prints. They were faint and mostly half covered by new snow, but they were definitely there. I stood over them for a while, not sure what I was seeing. They weren't mine. These tracks came from the woods and led up behind the cabin. They circled it once, and then disappeared back into the trees. At first, I thought maybe it was a hunter or someone hiking through, but I hadn't heard anything the night before. And who walks in deep snow around someone else's cabin at night? Still, I brushed it off. Maybe it was from earlier that morning before I got up. Maybe someone saw smoke from my chimney and got curious. I told myself that. That day, I stayed close to the cabin, hiked a little along the tree line, took some pictures of the snow, but I didn't go far. Something about the quiet felt heavier than before, like the woods were watching me. That night, after the sun went down, I sat inside with the lantern on and the fire burning strong. I kept thinking about those footprints. I hadn't seen any on the hike, which was weird. If someone had walked close enough to the cabin, they'd probably have been nearby too. But the forest had been untouched, only fresh snow. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, not from a noise, but from the feeling that something wasn't right. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and listened. The fire had died down to a soft crackle. The wind outside had stopped. It was silent. Then I heard it, the creak of wood, not inside the cabin, outside, like someone had stepped onto the porch. Just one slow step. I didn't move. My eyes were wide open in the dark, trying to adjust, trying to tell myself it was just ice shifting on the roof or maybe a branch falling. Then I heard another sound, a slow, dragging step across the porch boards. I sat completely still for maybe 10 minutes, barely breathing. Nothing else happened. I didn't hear footsteps walking away, no knocks, no calls, just that one or two soft sounds and then silence again. I eventually got up and grabbed the lantern. I lit it, unlocked the door, and stepped out into the freezing night. There was no one on the porch, just snow. But when I aimed the lantern at the ground, I saw prints, fresh ones, a single set. They came from the trees, walked across the clearing, stepped up onto the porch, and that was it. No prints walking away. I stepped down, checked around the cabin. I made one full circle, but I didn't see more tracks. Just those. I didn't sleep again that night. I kept the lantern on until morning. Every creak of the stove, every gust of wind made me jump. When it was finally light out, I bundled up and followed the tracks back into the woods, thinking maybe I could figure out where they came from. They went straight into the trees, winding between trunks, until they reached a spot where the snow was churned up, like someone had stood there a long time. Then the tracks just vanished. I turned around and went straight back to the cabin. My hands were shaking, and not from the cold. I didn't see anything that day. No animals, no more tracks. But I kept checking every few hours. My Jeep still worked. I even thought about leaving early, but part of me kept saying I was overreacting. No one had tried to come in. No damage. Maybe it was just some hiker. Maybe they were lost or curious and decided to turn around. It was easy to make excuses in the daylight. That night, I set up a small trap. I tied a few old tin cans together and set them on a string along the edge of the porch. If someone stepped up again, I'd hear it. I also kept the hatchet close by. I stayed awake most of the night, just staring at the door. Nothing happened. No cans. No creaking wood. Just silence. Around 4 a.m., I must have dozed off in the chair near the fire. I woke up again around 7, when the sky started turning gray. I went outside first thing. The cans were still in place. No prints. But when I checked behind the cabin, I found something else. A cigarette butt. It was half buried in snow, but fresh. Not wet. No ash. I don't smoke. No one had been here but me. Something changed in me after that. I wasn't just creeped out anymore. I was scared. Really scared. Not panic screaming scared. Just that quiet, hollow fear that settles deep in your chest when you know something's not right. I packed everything that morning. I was done. I loaded the Jeep, turned the engine over, and started driving down the trail that led back to the road. But the snow had other plans. About 2 miles out, I hit a drift that went up to my bumper. I tried to push through it, but my tires spun out. I backed up, tried again, and only dug myself deeper. I got out, shoveled as much as I could with my hands and a pot lid from the kitchen, but it didn't help much. After an hour of trying, I gave up and walked back to the cabin. I spent the rest of the day trying to get a signal on my phone. I climbed up a small ridge behind the trees, but nothing. No bars, no sounds, just snow falling heavier now, and the wind howling again. I stayed inside that night, locked every door and window, stacked furniture against the back door. I didn't light the fire. I didn't want the smoke to show. I didn't use any light. That night I heard the cans. Not once, 3 times. The first time, they clinked softly, like someone had just nudged them. The second time, they rattled harder, like they'd been kicked or stepped over. The third time, they crashed onto the porch floor and slid. I held the hatchet all night. I didn't move from my corner. I didn't sleep. I stared at the door until morning. When it got light again, I opened the door just a crack. The cans were scattered, and there, stuck in the doorframe, was a knife. Kitchen knife. My kitchen knife. It had been taken from inside the cabin. I stood there in the doorway, my heart pounding, looking at that knife. There were no new tracks in the snow. Nothing. Like whoever had done it had floated. I stepped outside. I was done playing defense. I wanted answers. I walked to the treeline and shouted. Nothing. I went back to the ridge and shouted again. Nothing but wind. Then I saw it. Far off. Maybe 300 feet away. A figure. Someone standing still between the trees, wearing a heavy coat and a hood, just watching me. I stared back. I couldn't see their face. I waved once. They didn't move. I turned